Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the second day of the 16th Annual General Meeting for the BC Assembly of First Nations. As you'll know, we had a very busy and productive day yesterday, having gotten through all of our agenda items and 13 of your on-time resolutions, all of which were passed, a few with amendments. In terms of our day today, we also, of course, have a very busy day, and we're starting with a bit of an information session here with our federal election candidates from British Columbia and one special guest. And so we do want to get to that, plus a series of presentations throughout the day, and the idea of getting through the remainder of your on-time resolutions today. Please note that noon today is the deadline for late resolutions, and as I noted earlier, there is the survey on climate change going on as well, and if you haven't already signed in, please make sure to do that. To get us started, of course, in a good way, and as is your custom, we will turn to Morgan Guerin, a councillor from Musqueam, to help us get started as he did yesterday. Morgan?
Siyam Nasiaya, dear friends and relatives, once again, Enta Setsaleno. My name is Morgan Guerin. My ancestral name is Setsaleno, by way of my family in Lummi, Washington. I was born and raised here in Musqueam, and it is my honor to do a little bit of protocol work to get our morning started. I was thinking this morning when I was walking in, I've never thought of a speech before coming out to do any of these work. In fact, my grandpa said, you go with an open heart, open your hand, and your ancestors will hold it, so the words will come. And as I was doing that, I was thinking of these things, but my home is the next house to the band office, so I didn't have to travel far. And I thought of many of you who have traveled far today, and I said in my heart, thanking you for that time, and I hope that you have safe travels to and from. And I also remember growing up with my late father, Chief Arnold George Guerin, as he traveled on his circuit discussing these things as well, going from nation to nation and traveling up through the interior and through the rest of British Columbia. And I remember being his shadow for many years. And I truly respect those who leave their home to go to a different territory to discuss those issues which are looking ahead to our children's future and the comfort of our elders. So once again, my hands are up to each and every one of you for making your way here. And I guess that really puts in perspective when the grandparents say, when you have a guest in your home, it is truly an honor. Treat them with that respect. So that said, I know we got some good cooks for you this morning as well. So speaking of that, this protocol, what we do, the welcoming for those who weren't here yesterday, in Musqueam, we used to have warriors that would watch out towards the ocean. They'd see our relatives coming in, either singing songs, or if they weren't singing songs, we'd definitely dispatch a group of warriors to go intercept them and see if they came with peace in their hearts and what their work was, and then bring them home to be in Musqueam. This beautiful protocol since the beginning of time. And it is indeed my honor to stand in the shadow of my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandpa, Kaya Palano, who was sent out with this message to the first European sails to these shores, and also told Simon Fraser right here that he's got to go back home for stealing a canoe, so it's not always a welcoming. But that said, it is indeed my honor to be here to do this, to open the floor for this work that you have today, knowing exactly what you're doing it for all of our people all over the land now known as British Columbia, to build a better future. At this time, I'd also like to thank some of these federal candidates for stepping forward. It's a big thing to put your name forward, to stand up for the people, and to stand in front of the people with your intentions, which really follows the work of this protocol I'm delivering today. So I'd like to thank you also for your time as well. So that said, on behalf of the Musqueam people, I welcome you to our traditional and unceded territory. Walk with a light heart. Walk towards Natsamat, where you are of one heart and one mind. I heard you had a bunch of resolutions passed with only a few amendments. That's a good step forward. So, Heitsepka, welcome.
Thank you very much for that, Morgan. Those are some of the nicest welcoming and opening remarks that I've heard in a while, so I appreciate that. We are going to turn very quickly to our first order of business, which is to hear from some of the candidates from the election, federal election. You'll note on your agenda and on the screen, we have 7 that have agreed to attend. I've seen 5 of them in the room, and I want to invite them forward. We did let them know that they would be asked to come forward together. There are seats here to my right, and there's a few seats to my left if we need them. And so please, I'll invite them forward. Elizabeth May, the federal Green Party leader. Jody Wilson-Raybould, independent candidate for Vancouver Granville. Jane Philpott, independent candidate for Markham-Stouffville, who's a special guest. Bob Chamberlain, the NDP candidate for Nanaimo Ladysmith. Michelle Corfield, the Liberal candidate for Nanaimo Ladysmith. Joan Phillip, the NDP candidate for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola. And Lydia Whitsom, the Green candidate for Cowichan Malahat Langford. Please come forward and find a chair to your liking. In terms of the order of speaking, we'll take them as they are listed on the agenda. So as noted, we've asked them to try to keep their remarks to, to keep their remarks to 5 minutes each, just to allow some time for interaction. And I do know there will be quite some interest, because as I heard on the radio today might be perhaps the worst Throwback Thursday photo day in Canadian history. So we know that's going to be an issue. The other thing I just want to encourage, again, as we're around the room having additional conversations, please remember that it does fill up the room, and let's be conscientious about that as well. So let us begin promptly. As I said, we'll take them in the order that they are on the agenda, and I invite them to either speak here from the podium or from the table microphones as they are comfortable. And our first speaker, and please help me welcome to the podium, the leader of the Green Party, Elizabeth May.
Thank you so much. Raise my hands to all of you in a language from the territory where I'm honored, privileged, and grateful to live, of the territory of Wasanak people, say in Sanchothan, Haishkasiam, Osiam. Thank you, Gayla Kessler. I'm deeply honored to be here this morning, and especially since, and some of our colleagues who aren't here yet, my friends Jody Wilson-Raybould and Jane Philpott, we had quite a rally last night. So getting here on time and keeping my eyes open, it's not that hard. But as Frank said when I walked in, you look exhausted. And I thought, diplomacy 101, can we get some help? But anyway, we're on a campaign trail, and I would never be anywhere but where I am requested to show up, to be useful. I recognize that this morning, as Harold just alluded to, the country is in something of a convulsion of how do we process this information of these photos. I'm not going to talk about them. I'm just going to say that when I look at this room, I'm looking directly at Chief Don Tom from Sartlip, who I know is on the council. When I look at the Indigenous leadership in this country, young, smart, respectful people who take integrity seriously, I think that the settler culture political class could learn a lot from the Indigenous leadership, and I raise my hands to all of you. It's an honor to work with you. In our platform, the Green Party of Canada is putting forward very clearly, very strongly, what I hope is the most progressive, most aligned to Indigenous concerns and values, whether First Nations, Métis, or Inuit of any of the parties. We are firmly committed to bringing in the legislation that makes the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People the law of the land. Somebody who knows something about the law of the land. Hey, Jody. So we want to make sure we bring it into reality, that all the laws of Canada are reviewed to ensure that they conform to free, prior, and informed consent. But that's not enough, because we really need to know, if we're dealing to government, nation to nation, that nation and that government can't be defined by legislation that was written in 1867 that says Indigenous peoples and nations get to be told by the government of Canada who's part of the nation. It's disrespectful, it's not sustainable. So we need to work forward with more. We need to, as the Green Party has done, repudiate the doctrine of discovery. We need to move forward recognizing that this process can be a bit messy. It will take some time, it will take some work, but the leadership in this process must come from Indigenous peoples and Indigenous nations to get ourselves out from under what was so accurately described by the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls as a system of laws that themselves constitute structural violence. So that's what we're still within. We operate within a system of structural violence from the law of the land. And I was proud to second Romeo Saganash's bill to recognize UNDRIP in Canada. We need to go beyond that and recognize all the calls for action and deliver on the calls for action from the TRC. And we must move forward, and the Green Party has accepted and will move forward on all of the many recommendations of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, because a lot of it was already our policy. Well, I shouldn't say because, we would do it anyway, but guaranteed livable income is already Green Party policy. Nothing is more important if you want justice in a society than making sure no one is poor, because poverty is the single largest contributor as a social determinant of health. Ill health comes from poverty. We must stop seeing children identified from birth as ready to be taken by the state. This must stop. So where I stand before you today as the only federal party leader who's here, I believe we need to have a wholesale change in settler culture Canadian thinking. We must be heart-led. I'm very, very honored and pleased to tell you that so many of our candidates in winnable ridings are Indigenous and Indigenous women. But one of my absent colleagues, as obviously Lydia Whitson is here, but as Russell Coy said at a rally the other day, and this is my commitment to you, it's time to step up and be a good ancestor. Haishkasiam.
Thank you very much, Madam Leader, and I want to also thank you for setting the tone by being precisely 5 minutes long. Our next candidate on your list, as you see, is the independent candidate for Vancouver Granville. Please help me welcome Jody Wilson-Raybould.
Well, thank you, Harold. Get myself sorted. Thank you, Harold. Galakasla, thank you to Musqueam for hosting us here today, and thank you to all, and acknowledge all of the leaders, all the chiefs, matriarchs, elders in the room. Thank you. The regional chief has left. There he is. From a former regional chief, I want to acknowledge and thank our current regional chief for his extraordinary work and his support for all of the nations around the table and across British Columbia, and for representing BC so well on the national stage. So Galakasla, Regional Chief Terry. So maybe I can introduce myself briefly, although I know many of you here and we've known each other for many years, but my name is Jody Wilson-Raybould. Of course, my traditional name is Puglas, and I'm incredibly proud to come from the Muskama, Tsawadénak, and Liquichta people of Northern Vancouver Island. Tim and I, my husband's here and my mother is here, Sandy, and my sister, we make our home in Vancouver, and I'm appreciative to be here along with all of these candidates that are running in the next federal election, and I find it incredibly encouraging that there are so many Indigenous peoples that are putting their names forward, and recognize how important it is to have a diversity of voices, to have Indigenous voices in Parliament and sitting around the important tables, not only these tables, but tables across the country that seek to advance Indigenous rights and title. So I'm going to be brief. I know we have a 5-minute limit, but I want to say that I have been incredibly honored and privileged to have been the Member of Parliament for Vancouver Granville for the last 4 years. And throughout the last 4 years, had an additional honor of being the Minister of Justice and the Attorney General of Canada, along with a brief period of time being the Minister of Veterans Affairs, which is also an incredibly important portfolio. I'm running as an independent this time in this election, and I will say that I certainly didn't expect to be in this position in terms of running as an independent, but I'll tell you that I am feeling an incredible sense of liberty and contentedness of where I'm at. And I am incredibly encouraged by the thousands, literally, of individuals that have reached out to me from across the country, that have communicated with me, constituents in my riding, and encouraged me to run, and are supporting me to run as an independent Member of Parliament. I think that we are in a period of time, and every election is important, but particularly this one is important in terms of how we are moving forward, how we are understanding the very nature of our democracy and what it means to ensure that all voices are heard. As an independent, and I don't know if there's anybody that's a constituent in Vancouver Granville here, but broadly speaking, I think we need more independent voices in Parliament, more independent voices to ensure that we can reach across party lines to embrace the diversity of opinions and the best ideas and the best solutions so we can solve the major issues that are facing us at this moment in time. No one party has the solutions or has a monopoly on all of the solutions or all of the truths. Whether we're looking and talking about climate change, whether we're talking about the importance of Indigenous reconciliation, we need to do that, and we need to resolve those issues together. I have 1 minute left, but I'm really glad that Elizabeth May preceded me in her talking. Climate change is the biggest issue that is facing us. I acknowledge that the AFN and the national chief and all the regional chiefs across the country have highlighted that in their document and pressing for the importance of focusing on the environment as we move into this election. Indigenous peoples have a fundamental role to play in ensuring that as the traditional caretakers and stewards of the land, to ensure that our environment lives on for future generations. There's a lot of issues at play in this election. I would encourage everybody to get out en masse and vote, as we did in the last election. And I would encourage people to vote for the candidate that will best represent your interests and your concerns, that will best advocate for advancing Indigenous title and rights, advancing the rebuilding of Indigenous nations. And for my part, I think it's on my website now, but I've posted a blog about where I think we're heading and what I think that we can do in terms of Indigenous issues in this country. There's 10 action items on it. They're condensed, and it is reflective of all of the extraordinary amount of work that we have done as Indigenous peoples and that has happened in this country. And this is a little bit of self-promotion, but not really. I wanted to thank all of the leaders in British Columbia. I'm releasing a book today, and the book is based on the extraordinary work that has happened in British Columbia and across the country, and it speaks to a decade of speeches that I've given, and those words, the words in those speeches have come from you, and all of the extraordinary work that our people, that Indigenous peoples have done in terms of rebuilding our nations within a stronger Canada. There's lots more work to do, and I'm committed to being an advocate, an ongoing advocate for you. This is the first copy that I will have ever given away, and this goes to your Regional Chief Terry. Gela Kusla, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that. As noted, we do have a special guest joining us as a result of her work with Jody last night on the independent campaign. So please help me welcome the independent candidate for Markham Stouffville, who we all remember as the Minister of Health and perhaps the most respected Minister of Indigenous Affairs that we've ever seen. So please help me welcome Jane Philpott.
Thank you, Harold, for that very generous introduction, and thank you for the honor of being here today and being included in this panel, because I had the privilege of being here last night for Jody's rally. I also want to thank the Musqueam Nation for allowing us to gather in this place, and want to acknowledge all of the Coast Salish peoples for your generosity of spirit and your care for this land. I want to thank the regional chief and so many others around the table who have become friends over the years, many new faces as well, but it's a delight to be here with you today. Just by way of introduction, I am the independent member of parliament and an independent candidate in the riding of Markham Stouffville, which feels like a long way from here right now, but very happy to be here because the issues that you are talking about today and that you are interested in as it relates to the upcoming federal election are issues that are near and dear to me, areas where I learned and worked over the years, being both Minister of Health, Minister of Indigenous Services, and President of the Treasury Board. I am a family doctor by background, but have decided to run as an independent candidate because I believe that my work as a federal representative is not yet done, and I hope that the people of Markham Stouffville will give me the great honor of continuing to represent them. In the few minutes that I have, I know that some of the really, really important national issues are going to be covered by some of the other candidates on the stage, and so I wanted to, and I will acknowledge those to be the top priority issues that I hope you are all raising with the candidates in your ridings. I think the three biggest issues in this election are climate action, the rights of Indigenous peoples, and democratic reform. And so I hope you will push in everywhere that you are. Those happen to be the top three issues that the Green Party mentioned as well, but you will hear those from many candidates, and I hope you will ask for action. I wanted to use the time that I have to go into some specific details because of the privilege that I have of being aware of some of the big challenges within Indigenous services itself, and to ask you please to advocate on behalf of First Nations across the country for places where I believe that the government has not yet done what must be done. And so there are a few that I wanted to mention in particular. The first is the issue of child welfare, and I'm very grateful to have had the privilege of working with many of you, and I want to give a shout out to Kupi Christian, who is here, who worked along with Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafond on helping to co-draft the legislation. We are, I think, the general sense is that the legislation that passed will be helpful. I'm seeing action already in British Columbia, where they have already made a statement last week about no longer using the birth alert system. So there's good that has come out of that legislation, but it's not everything that you wanted. And I believe that we need to continue to push, and you should hold your elected representatives accountable to push for a whole range of issues, including full recognition of rights being included in that bill, and statutory funding. And I won't go into the details on that, but you must continue to push. That bill is not yet finished, needs to be further amended to have that funding in it. The second issue I wanted to talk about is housing and infrastructure, and there is such a massive gap in each of these particular areas, but the housing gap on reserve, I have to give a particular ask of you to help me to advocate for. I know you have massive issues in urban centers as well, for First Nations living in urban centers, but across this country, there's a $30 to $40 billion infrastructure gap on reserve. People are living in abominable conditions, and the government has not yet done nearly enough. An additional $200 million a year was a drop in the bucket to address the gaps that are there. It's not just money, it's serious structural issues. Of course, it's recognition of rights and recognition of land and territory, but please continue to fight for infrastructure funding. And if I may make a specific need, and I say this because the leaders of BC are so extraordinary, and you have advanced rights and the well-being of Indigenous people so well. There are brothers and sisters in other parts of this country that need your help, and I specifically ask on behalf of many of the First Nations in Northern Ontario, specifically a place like Grassy Narrows, where I still cannot understand why the federal government is not funding the health center at Grassy Narrows. It's $20 million. We have a massive budget in this country, and if our government cannot find $20 million to build a health center for people who were poisoned by industrial contamination half a century ago, then we should be ashamed. So please help advocate for those who are in the most vulnerable positions across the country, and fight for clean water, for housing, and for the infrastructure needs on reserve. And the last area I'll ask you to please continue to fight for, and I actually haven't followed all the details as closely, but Grand Chief Ed John, the month that I became Minister of Indigenous Services, asked me for funding for emergency management, and particularly for prevention of wildfires. And I don't believe, unless I've been mistaken, Ed, that you ever got the funding that you asked for. Is that correct? Some of it, not enough. Thank God there weren't horrible wildfires this year the way that there were in 2017 and 2018. But there's so much more that needs to be done here in British Columbia for prevention. Ed and many, many others among you have the knowledge of what needs to be done. You need to be resourced for that. When I had the privilege of going up to Tahltan, I am still, I will never forget what I saw and the damage that was done there. Please advocate for one another, and I know my time is out. I will continue to be an ally in whatever way I can. Thank you so much for the privilege of inviting me to here to be with you today. Merci beaucoup, et chi miigwech.
Thank you very much, Jane. The NDP candidate for Nanaimo Ladysmith, Bob Chamberlain. Please help me welcome Bob.
Gelikas la hamas lo klatle. Nu guam gelaga me gaith laka quaquasutinu kwatmis. Gelikas la musquium, mustimuch. Wheatla megans nunmacolas quatnala. So ola gela iklegins iti dudoko namut, ninok sola, ninokad. My traditional name is Galagame. Of course, I've recognized that we're on the territory of the Musqueam Nation. I've thanked you all and said it's good to see you all again. And I hope you're happy to see me. I'm not sure. I believe most of you are. I agree that we need MPs, First Nations, to change the courts of government. Canada has marched down a road far too long with the absolute denial of the human rights of Aboriginal people in this country. It's time for this to stop. We've had promises that were duly broken. We've had treaties that were promptly forgotten. We've had human rights tribunals ruling on Canada's disregard for our children. And this, to me, perpetuates the colonial mindset of destroying our people through our children. We know far too often that our children are in care, and the overrepresentation is something that we have fought tooth and nail to stop. It's a slow drip genocide. And I know that when we think about what is the major struggles that we face in our territories is having true recognition of the authority that we have, our inherent title, our inherent jurisdiction, and the inherent rights that has been put to us from our Creator and is not a gift from the Crown. For far too long, I've witnessed the governments disregard the Constitution, disregard Supreme Court of Canada rulings. And this is what has to change fundamentally, is the government's view. Their definition of Aboriginal rights is not a gift to our people. It's a term to help them understand the human rights that we have in our lands. And the fact that we have countless Supreme Court rulings that talk about our title, that talk about our rights, to give direction to the Crown to engage with us for the honor of the Crown, and that they completely continue to disregard this is utterly unacceptable. The New Democratic Party has a plan to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I look forward to participating in advancing this very important international document for all First Nations across Canada. I'm proud to tell you that a table that I sat at where I was co-chair, chief negotiator with the Numgis and the Mamalilakla were the first table to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People in Canada. This is the understanding that I've gathered from you. This is the knowledge that I've absorbed from the dialogues of the chiefs at tables such as this. And it is that knowledge that I go forward to stand in Ottawa to ensure that at every single opportunity, Aboriginal rights and title are spoken to, and to ensure that the Crown, the governments of all stripes, all parties, understand that there's an undeniable truth that needs to be addressed, and it's the shame of colonialism. And I've heard many times as a member of the First Nation Leadership Council, you do not speak for us. Nothing for us without us. And I believe that to be very true. It has to be a foundation to go forward. We cannot rebuild our governance systems as we've always had, only to be told by the government how you will fit into Confederation. Because that's what I've seen, and that's what I continue to see. Nothing for us without us. This has to be understood in every hall of government. So when we consider what's going on in our territories, I think back to when I got to speak to Minister McKenna about her role for climate change. And I was very clear, because I was listening to I was mindful of the commitments of the Liberal government. Whole of government approach, science-based decisions. And so I expressed to her that we needed to see that in relationship to global warming. We needed to see that in relationship to food security for our peoples across this country, and we did not see it. When we see the poor returns of salmon here, you all know what salmon means to me. Fish farms, there I said it. I know some of you were waiting. But for 14 years I stood and spoke for the protection of wild salmon. For 14 years I never let that issue go because I know it's important to all of us. This includes fish farms, it includes the environment, it includes watershed management, it includes runoff from agriculture and rivers, and as my good friend Grand Chief Bob Pascoe told me, it includes the effluent that comes out of garbage dumps on the Fraser. There is a lot of work to do to make sure that the primary food source for British Columbia First Nations is there for all of us. And when we think about it, many of our people, and your village is much like mine, we struggle with poverty. And I've said time and time again, when we struggle with poverty, the traditional foods are a means of survival. It's not simply a menu choice. It is who we are as people. And this is something I think Canada has forgotten when they step up with mitigation strategies, because that doesn't work. Are we done? And Howard says he's going to give me, or Harold's going to give me an extra 5 minutes. No, he's done. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. So I want to thank you all for hearing me out this morning. And of course, I want to encourage all of you to support my campaign financially. Gaelic has that.
Thank you very much, Bob. Turning to the Liberal candidate for Nanaimo Ladysmith, I just wanted to make one observation that in the Canadian electoral system, we do not get to vote for the leader. We only get to vote for the Liberal in our riding, or for the candidates in our riding. So let me rephrase that. Yeah. Somebody call Dr. Freud. Please help me welcome our friend and colleague Michelle Corfield.
Chu Kleko Hatwia a ichum saksi tapatsi. Kleko muskbiam, for allowing us to mamuk in your hahoti. Uklama Motaski. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. Michelle Corfield, a member of the Yuthuthat Nation. I'm excited to be here today as the Liberal candidate for Nanaimo Ladysmith. Like many of you, I have worked the past 25 years in several capacities on important initiatives. And I see from the agenda that you continue to work on those initiatives today. I will continue to work on these important initiatives if I'm elected in Nanaimo Ladysmith, Bob. Yeah. Last year, I had to do some serious soul searching on how I could better represent Indigenous people across Canada in the federal legislative process. Many of you know that the process of government is still foreign to us and is a colonial regime. However, BC First Nations have utilized government methods to advance our issues that have been important for our people and ancestors for decades. We have become better at using the colonial government means to improve the lives of Indigenous peoples across the country and the world. Many of you are probably wondering why I've chosen the Liberal Party. Understandably, it would cause some of you to have concerns about my selection. I've reviewed all the Canadian parties, their core values and objectives, and I also took a look at what this government has done for First Nations in Canada, especially within BC. And I truly believe that the vision of the Liberal Party is one that will continue to help us move forward together. The renewed relationship Canada has with Indigenous people is still new and has been contentious at times. Relationships are built on trust, understanding, and mutual respect, all of which must be important to all parties to understand and take ownership of. The Liberal Party of Canada has shown importance of their commitment to the relationship with Indigenous peoples by making historic investments of billions of dollars into our communities in the past 4 years, and also done so under previous Liberal leadership. There has been real change and real results, tangible results that haven't been felt in our communities for decades. I also fear that change in the ruling government would lead to Indigenous communities back to where we were during the Harper years of government. This is why, as an Indigenous candidate, it will be important for me to ensure that the government continues to make its commitments. There have been significant accomplishments in the past 4 years, and I personally believe would not have progressed without the current government's improvement for real change. These include establishing and maintaining a bilateral relationship with the AFN, ITK, and the 4 Inuit and Nunagat regions, the Métis National Council, and modern treaty and self-governing nations. The exoneration of the Sikwitine chiefs who died defending their lands, their people, and their way of life. The launching of the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Forgiving and reimbursing loans to more than 200 Indigenous communities across the country. Co-developed the new fiscal policy for modern treaty and self-governing nations with substantial investments for those nations to establish real governance structures that is comparable to other governments. Partnered with the national Indigenous organizations to co-develop a 10-year, $1.7 billion Indigenous early learning and child care framework that reflect the unique cultures and needs of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children. Providing another $170 million in Budget 218 to help accelerate progress on lifting drinking water advisories, and with 87 long-term advisories lifted to date and are on track to have all lifted by March 2021. More than $1 billion has been committed to First Nations housing on reserve. Signed 2 memorandums of understanding with Government of British Columbia specifically related to child and family services with the Wet'suwet'en and Cowichan tribes. These are just a small fraction of the successes and investments that the Liberal Party has achieved in the past 4 years. Work continues, and this government is committed to keep working to renew the nation-to-nation, Inuit Crown, and government-to-government relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. As First Nations, we are used to voting for family or tribal politics, sometimes not necessarily the best candidate that will work hard for constituents. There are very some talented candidates from all parties, and I will ask you to consider, as we approach October 21st, to get to know all the candidates in your riding and how they plan to support Indigenous peoples. As the National Chief Perry Bellegarde has stated in its report, Canada's promise, a new relationship, and a national agenda. Canada has made commitments to the people of First Nations, commitments to close the gap, to ensure fair treatment, to the relationship built on respect. We are moving towards a strong foundation to address decades of underfunding and injustice, and more than ever, we are doing so together. This turning point in Canadian and world history requires a wake-up call focused on the state of our natural world and a commitment to ensure all children are equipped to build prosperous futures, and a promise that health, education, and justice systems will work equally for everyone. This plan we call Honoring Promises points the way to real transformative change. The time is to act now. As the Liberal candidate for Nanaimo Ladysmith, I will actively and strongly advocate for this new relationship and national agenda within the Liberal Party. Kleko Chu.
Thank you very much, Michelle. The NDP candidate for Central Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola. Please help me welcome our friend and colleague, Joan Phillip.
Why Hasselhold Slach Ipisnaxil Isquistamtion. That's just greetings, friends and relatives. My traditional name is Aimshin. I recall when I got involved in politics, I was 16 years old, and my very first protest was at Frank's Landing in the United States, where people were fighting for their right to salmon, and they've subsequently won that right. I got involved in politics because initially I was really angry. But since having children, it softened my edges, and I realized that it's born out of my love for the land and my love for people. And in the Okanagan, the elders have told us we have 4 responsibilities: a responsibility to the land, to the people, to our culture, which includes language, and to our spirituality. Together, Stuart and I have 5 children and 15 grandchildren. And unfortunately, we lost one of our sons to carfentanil last year. I'm running because we need a strong voice in Ottawa to stand up our rights. The New Democratic Party, as my colleague Bob Chamberlain has mentioned, we're committed to implementing the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous Peoples. And it's not rights that will be conferred upon us. I understand that, this is inherent. Our rights are inherent. It's simply a means of upholding our laws and our traditions and that we already know we have. I'm really committed to the environment, and it's because we have salmon. When I was born and raised in North Vancouver. 90% of our diet was marine protein. It was clams, crabs, oysters, and fish and more fish. You can't eat out of there anymore, Burrard Inlet. And my children and my grandchildren can't eat the shellfish out of that area. And we need to clean it up. We've had 152 years one party and another, and I think we need change. We need to hold everyone up. Pollution doesn't stop at the reserve border. Everybody's water is polluted, and everybody's air is polluted, and we have to clean it up, and our lives depend on it. Global warming, we've seen the most horrific fires and floods that we haven't seen in 10, 20 years. And it's almost, we're at the brink of no return. And we need to clean it up. And we need to do that together, collectively. I just want to say I'm just so honored to be here. I'm honored to sit with some really stellar individuals. And in spite of the fact that we might not share the same worldview, I hold you up. And thank you for taking this bold step in wanting to represent us and what we need to do. And I'm willing to work with anyone who's willing to help. We're at a really critical point, and we need to pull together. And it doesn't matter what stripe we are. We have in the NDP, we have a green plan. And we didn't take it all from them, but anyway. But as I said, I'm willing to work with anyone. We need to ensure that our children and our communities are treated fairly and equitably. And that has not happened. That has not happened. And we need to hold Canada's feet to the fire in order to make that happen. So I'm just so happy to be here. As you know, of course I'm running, but us candidates and our campaigns, they cost money. So give lots and give often. You can search our websites, but please donate to our campaigns so that we can do the work that needs to get done in Ottawa.
Thank you very much, Joan. The Green candidate for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford, please help me welcome our friend and colleague, Lydia Whitson.
Siamnasiaya, respected friends. Siamnitshualmuch, our respected First Nations people. Siamnasalthuan, respected elders. I'm truly thankful for the presence of every one of you and the good work that you do. I'm emotional right off the bat because this is a really important step for me. And for opening the way for us. I'm thankful for this whole set of candidates and leaders that have stepped up to see an stronger Indigenous voice. I'm so proud and pleased to be here sharing this platform with you. We're in a climate emergency. Part of the work that we need to do is work together. You know, the reaching across party lines, reaching across peoples and nations, it's that collective effort we know we need. And we've heard Elizabeth say, it's all hands on deck. We need to work together to address issues with respect to climate change. As Indigenous, as Hualmuch Mistimuch, as Indigenous people, close to the land, close to our territories, we feel it first. We see and feel the impact of climate change in terms of our access to our foods and plants and world, natural world that has sustained us. Part of the work that we need to do, is, as I said, is this business of really working together, doing government differently, stepping up and saying, we're all in for Canadians, for Hualmuk Mistimuk, across the board, for all Canadians. And part of the work that I'm stepping up to do is try to do that, do the same kind of work that I've done for us as Hualmuk Mistimuk, whether we're looking at the early stages of trying to think about how do we work together for health in this province. I remember chairing then the Health Council, and at that time, BCAFN had a health agenda, UBCIC had a health agenda, First Nations Summit had a health agenda, and we all had envelopes. And it was when we came and sat down together and said, let's trust each other enough to put all those envelopes on the table and make one plan for the health of our people in this province. And those were the building blocks of us moving forward to create the First Nations Health Authority. And that's Indigenous people leading the way and showing how it is that when you reflect our values and our ways of being, we can really positively get stuff done. When I think about how we're going to incorporate the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. There's lots of words and people can say it and we can even make it shorter and say UNDRIP, but the fact is, how are we going to implement it? And that's what I want to do. I want to be part of taking those next steps, bringing government along and showing them how we can incorporate the values of Indigenous people reflected in the UN Declaration in a way that helps this whole country. As a provincial example, and I'll talk a little bit about the BC Environmental Assessment Act in British Columbia. Last year, I was asked to co-chair a multilateral table to bring all kinds of voices together to look at how are we going to change the BC Environmental Assessment Act, and the Minister Heyman had asked me to come and co-chair that because he wanted to incorporate UNDRIP principles. And so it's one thing to talk about doing it, it's another thing to actually do it. And that's part of what I want to bring forward when we look at incorporating and changing the law in British Columbia last year with respect to the BC Environmental Assessment Act, incorporating UNDRIP principles, actually looking at what does free, prior, and informed consent look like. It's not a single point in time, it's a process. And we need to ensure that that process is respected and implemented, and it is doable. Some leaders in this country think you can't implement free, prior, and informed consent for Indigenous people, but it's doable. Those are the building blocks that I want to bring to Parliament and help this country figure out that it's very doable in terms of recognizing and respecting Indigenous rights, incorporating our views with respect to UNDRIP, with respect to TRC. We've been studied and studied and studied, right? There's lots of recommendations. It's time for action. And that's what I want to be part of, is taking those steps to bring our values, our worldview, our ways of being as a pathway to solution for this country in terms of the way we need to make decisions that respects all of humanity, recognizes that we're in a crisis with respect to our environment, and we need to work together. So these are the reasons I'm stepping up, and I don't even see the timer. Am I supposed to? I'm done. Okay. Well, that was really exciting and fun. I'm really thankful for this opportunity. Thanking RCTG for the invitation and as well. Just so thankful for the opportunity. Thank you. I wasn't looking at the time.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes for some commentary. Microphone 13, Charles, 14.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Charles Morvan, Chief Counselor from the Nisga'a Village of Gitwinseth. And I've been trying to construct my question the best way I can. As you all may have seen in the news in regards to a story that has come up in regards to past actions of the leader of the Liberal Party. And based on how each of our First Nations people take pride in principles and values on how we are to act, how we are to represent ourselves with respect. I'd like to know your thoughts in regards to when that happens, how you feel about leaders of a country like Canada when those things come up, how it affects your beliefs and principles and values of yourselves. Thank you.
And Charles, if I could just clarify, is that for everyone?
It's for everyone.
Thank you. I'll look to the panel to see who wishes to respond. Jody?
Thank you, Galakasa, for the question. And I will say that, first of all, as I said in my opening remarks, I'm incredibly proud to be an Indigenous person in this country. And I was raised by my grandparents and my parents and my extended family to know who I am and to be proud of who I am, and taught the values of inclusion, equality, and understanding that everybody in a community has a role to play. I said this yesterday and I'll say it again today. I was incredibly disappointed when I saw the comments of the leader of the Liberal Party, or the picture rather. There is no place in our country to take pictures or act in that way. As Indigenous people, as an Indigenous person myself who has faced racism and discrimination, it's entirely unacceptable.
Gayla Kessler, thank you for asking us. It's a hard one. It's not hard to say the following. How did I feel? I felt physically ill. I looked at the photos and I felt physically ill. I recognize that despite having had, whatever economic problems or, poverty in my past, when you have white skin, you're a person of privilege. There's just no question about it. And I don't think Justin Trudeau understands yet that the requirements of social justice require kind of a personal, internal process of understanding that settler culture Canadians are people of privilege. And if you want to form a position of solidarity with Indigenous peoples, with people of color, you have to step up. And that was not that long ago. He was a grown man. So I don't know what to say, Charles. I'm sick about it, and I think about the impact for every child in this country, Indigenous or people of color, and how it impacts them personally. It does harm. It's racist.
Oh, what to say? I guess when I saw it, I was frustrated and confused and hurt, and I thought, I don't even know what to say. We can't wash the color of our skin off. This is who we are. And so to have leaders set the example, and that was a really bad one. And when you think about how we as Indigenous people have battled against discrimination and all of the harms and hurts that have happened because of the color of our skin and where the values we have, it's just frustrating to see a leader that can't set the sort of example that this country deserves.
Gayla Kessler, dached for your question. Very important one given the developments of yesterday. I was incredibly disappointed to see those pictures and this morning the video of Prime Minister Trudeau. But the sad fact is racism is alive and well in Canada. And to know that the words of Prime Minister Trudeau upon election, and actually before the election, elevated the hopes of the most impoverished people of this country, the Indigenous peoples from coast to coast to coast. And my experience has been that I reflect, I reflect back on Romeo Saganash's comments that he retracted in the House of Commons. And I think of, you know, Romeo's work with the NDP to advance the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And why was it one of the parties in opposition that had to do that? Why was it the senators from the Conservative Party that did their tricks to make sure it died on the paper? This is the reality that I speak of that Canada has to come to terms with. And for me personally, I reflect back to the teachings of my elder Mantlidas, Michael Dick, who taught me our songs, our culture, and our ways of life. And he told me about the origin stories of all our peoples. And he imprinted upon me that none is more important than the other. And in his way of teaching me is that we Lamegans Numbagwanama, that we are one people. And that's what I envision for Canada.
Limnum. When I first heard about what happened, I was under the impression that the painted face was a teenager, and when I found out he was 29, I thought that's absolutely unacceptable for an adult. And his apology is hollow. There's two parts to an apology. There's the apology, and then there's how do I make it right? Just like Canada, when they apologize for what they did to us, they have to make it right. And it's up to us to determine what that right is. And if he had any integrity whatsoever, he'd just step down. Nimlin.
You can use microphone 6.
Sorry. You go ahead. You want
No, I'm going to
okay. I'll just make 3 brief comments of principles that I think we need to keep in mind in response to this. One is that when we see acts of racism, we should call them out, as well as understanding their systemic roots and that there's something deeper going on. The second is that I think we should expect the highest levels of integrity from our leaders, and that means that nothing should be hidden from us, certainly not for a long period of time. And the third is that I think we need to hold our representatives to account. And in the case of party leaders, I think other representatives of that party should hold their leader to account.
I was disappointed. And then I heard it was 20 years ago, and it was at Point Grey. Many of the children of Musqueam go to Point Grey. And I had to think about where I was 20 years ago, and what I was doing 20 years ago, and what my life was like 20 years ago. And from that, I heard my grandma. We all make mistakes, and we all need to be forgiven for those mistakes when we ask for it. We ask to go forward in our lives based on our experiences. Based on those experiences, we all sit here today. Whether they're good, bad, or indifferent, we are who we are based on where we have come from and everything that we have lived through. So, what I say today is, I hope the country learns a lesson from this, and that they take away something that is going to change people on a go forward. So that is my hope, because he has asked for forgiveness, he has said sorry. It is now time for us as a country to look at that and take something from it. And that's what I took from it. And I mean, of course, I had to sit with this. So I hope you can understand that was my feelings. Thanks.
Thank you. Microphone 28.
First of all, I'd like to thank all the candidates for coming forward. you all said something that had interest inside of me. The first one was with Jody, the independent, right? I wish you all came with as youth, you know, not with a label behind you that's I'm green, I'm orange, I'm red, whatever. I see something in each and every one of you, and that's a gift. If we all work together, like we do here, we, you know, get along a lot better, right? I'm glad I heard farm fish. We need farm fish out of here. But you know, we had a historical 4 years. My community has received letters of commitment. We received commitment from our riding leader, who was a liberal riding. And historically, they came to my community. They came to my council meetings. That's historical. Federal government has actually come to my community, and we're federal jurisdiction. We are. Each one of our communities are federal jurisdiction. So what does that make us? Us chiefs. We're federal. It's time to put us where we belong in your constitutions. We're almost at a point where we're almost complete our constitution of status. You know, I heard my uncle say back in the day in the 80s, when I finish my constitution, I'm going to put you somewhere in there, you know, and you're going to have to work with me. You're going to have to work with our people. I don't know if it's going to be under Section 35 or whatever it may be. I'm going to put you somewhere in there because it's going to be your obligation to work with us regardless. So with that, I wish you all the best in your riding, wherever it may be. I have family in all those places where you know, your ridings are, right? That doesn't mean I'm going to phone them for you, Bob, right? But I have an empty pocket, so I don't have too much to donate. So, but with that, I hope if you get in, I hope that you continue the work and relationships that have been started. We wanted Mr. Harper out, right? And we accomplished that. We stood together. And with everything that we received, I'm hoping that that continues regardless. If you get in, right? We need to continue that work and relationships that we've started. ACM.
Elizabeth, want to respond?
I want to speak to, and thank you for your comments. First of all, again, to reiterate what Bob said on behalf of the NDP, I would say, just so you know, in the Green Platform as well, I don't call them fish farms. One of my constituents in one town hall meeting said, stop calling them fish farms. It sounds benign. Call them toxic fish factories, because that's what they are. So we would take them out of the water, and there's more detail on the platform. But the thing I really wanted to talk about, as a federal party leader, the Green Party is different in that we completely agree with you. The founder of the Green Party of Germany, Petra Kelly, used to call the Greens the anti-party party. Partisanship is an enemy of democracy. The my team versus your team, the color coding, the whole thing. You know, political parties aren't mentioned in the Canadian Constitution. For our Westminster parliamentary system to work, we don't need political parties at all. If I could wave a magic wand and get rid of all the colors and say, look, we elect, as Harold was saying, The choice you make on the ballot is your MP. That's the person you're picking. You're not picking the party leader, but we run the campaigns in this country as if we had a presidential system, as if there was a ballot out there that said Justin Trudeau, Jagmeet Singh, Andrew Scheer, Elizabeth May. And then people say, oh, no, the ballot you have is the candidate in front of you. So we do politics differently. There, I was at Jody's rally last night to call for more independent voices in our parliament. And I give you my word that the Greens are fully committed to always working across party lines, because hyper-partisanship, the constant smearing, the attack, the elbows out like this is not helpful. We have to work together.
Anyone else? Lydia and Joan. Microphone 5. Lydia first and then Joan. And then we'll go to the next questioner.
Okay, one. Hi, Chika. Thanks for the question. Part of the reason that I'm running for the Green Party is that I'm, and the leader is here to attest to it, that I'm allowed to have my voice as an Indigenous woman bringing my values to this party. The Green Party, I mean, this is the language they use. They don't whip their, it's so funny to hear the language they use even, but they don't whip their optimistically MP, to act in a certain way. I'm well equipped with my values and my voice as an Indigenous woman, and that's why I'm running for the Green Party, is that I can express that.
Microphone 6.
Why? I was born and raised in North Vancouver, and my late grandfather, Chief Dan George, when he delivered his lament, one of the things he talked about was not just what our authority being taken from us. He said that someday our children will pick up the tools of the white man's success and rise out of the sea like the thunderbird of old. And I really honestly believe that those of us here are the ones we've been waiting for, right?
Thank you. Microphone 6, Bob. Bob? Either one.
I think many of you knew when fish farms was mentioned again, I was going to speak. Having fish farms removed from the ocean is one of the most critical events that needs to happen for wild salmon. But we also have to be mindful about our people's rights, our inherent right to salmon. And this, I've heard, of course, I've been monitoring all the other parties, no surprise. But when Mr. Paul Manley launched his campaign in Nanaimo Ladysmith, he had Pamela Anderson standing with him. And the reason I mention that, because I've stood with Pamela Anderson as well when she came, I think it was in 2016, on the fish farm issue, to no great addition to the struggle. But what I found kind of fascinating or disappointing is the fact that less than a week later or 10 days later, she made a very public statement about ending all fisheries for 50 years. And to me, I find that very troubling, because we have rights to fish. We survive on fish. Our people need fish. And so to see such a close alignment with someone that spoke so off the cuff, it caused me some grief. Thank you.
Microphone 5.
Thank you for the comments and the question, or thanks for comments. And I just want to say quickly that when we're talking about independence and when we're talking about moving away from partisanship, we're talking about, if I can be so bold, an Indigenous worldview, and looking at working together towards consensus-based decision-making, where We don't all necessarily agree, but we debate the issues, and we have an ultimate goal in mind, which is to improve the quality of life for our people and ensure practicing and thriving cultures. I think that's the ultimate goal that we want to have in terms of Canadians generally. So we need to move beyond partisanship if we're ever going to create the space for true reconciliation with Indigenous peoples in this country. And your work that you've done in terms of rebuilding your nation, rebuilding governance, and the success that you've had, and there's success right across the country, and that success has been attributed to this government and previous governments. We need to build on that success. That was the motto that we had when I was fortunate enough to be the regional chief here. No one's going to take that away, but the success is too few and far between. And we need to create the space through the development of a rights recognition framework where we take Section 35 of the Constitution and say it's a full box of rights, embrace the minimum standards of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, and as a government, as the federal government, create the space to operationalize those rights on the ground based on the priorities of our community. That's how we're going to rebuild our nations, and that's how we're going to make a stronger Canada. So that's what every person that is running, irrespective of color or party or independence, needs to embrace.
All right, we have less than 15 minutes left. Go to microphone 23.
Good morning. Chief Willie Blackwater from Kijuka First Nation. First of all, foremost is I'd like to pay respect and honor Jody and Jane. The courage and the integrity that the both of you did as leaders has actually had a huge impact and start changing our dynamics of our leadership in our band council, because it's our matriarchs are starting to teach us how to be accountable, be transparent, and all of that, right? So it has a huge impact, right? And I'm quite honored to sit here and speak to the both of you. And Bob, I can never stop listening to you. Sometimes I have to turn down the volume, but I do listen to you. You know, it's wonderful to see you up there, Bob, and I've known you like for quite a long time, and you know, it's a great honor and privilege to see that you're running, and I do hope that you get in. I'm sorry about your competition on Holiday Smith. So. Anyway, to all candidates, one of the key messages I'd like to get out here is that the continual reaping of our natural resources, our minerals, our waters, forestry and stuff like that. So that's a key foundation to our current poverty, our crisis, housing dilemmas, and all of that, right? You know, and they're contributing factors to our social determinants and stuff like that. These are the things that really need to be brought forth and stuff like that. And I have to bring back that Dalgamuk court case. You know, we've proven beyond a shadow of doubt that everything on our land is ours. So that you know, that needs to be addressed on a continual basis at a high level and continued pressure. And on behalf of the Indian residential school survivors, as most of you probably know on the panel there, that I'm the named plaintiff on the residential school. And the success of the court case, we still haven't seen all that TRC recommendations fully implemented. That's something that needs to be brought forth. And one of the key messages, that I'm bringing forth on behalf of the Blackwater plaintiffs is that 2 of our men during the court case died. And it's a battle that should never be forgotten. And we've asked to be rightfully honored and recognized, the Blackwater plaintiffs, for the courage, because a man from the Gitsan died during the process, a man from the Nisga'a died during the process. Their families should never be forgotten, and their courage should never be forgotten. And the men that were in the Blackwater, some of their lives are just drastically on a path of suicide with their continual addiction and drugs because of their battle. So what I'm saying on behalf of these men is that, I brought it forth to the BCAFN resolution, the AFN resolution, that there needs to be we requested a rightful honor ceremony for them for September 30th of this year, and the resolution. And we also requested September 30th to be declared a national holiday for Indian Residential School. So if you guys will bring that forth and put pressure on that, thank you very much. And Jane, you're quite aware of this, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Commentary? Elizabeth, microphone 5.
Chief Blackwater, thank you. I want to thank you for your leadership. I want to confirm that the Green Party, of course, supports September 30th, Orange Shirt Day, being recognized as a national day with the appropriate supports. I want to take a quick moment just to reassure everyone here that Pamela Anderson doesn't speak for the Green Party. She's a resident of Ladysmith, and she's a movie star, but she's not a candidate, and she doesn't have any right to speak for us, and we don't agree at all. We are fully committed to recognizing rights and title as inherent, including to the resources that are to which under our Constitution already, if we recognize Section 35, there should be no question, there should be no debate. The nonpartisanship that's required to work across party lines is something that I'm fully committed to as the leader of a party where, I'll be very honest with you because I'm never anything but honest, but, if everybody votes Green, I'll be Prime Minister. But it's not likely to happen. So just to be clear, I take my responsibilities seriously. I will do my very, very best, no matter what the outcome of this election, to be of service to our goals of justice, real justice. We can't achieve climate action and avoid that Mother Earth no longer becomes a place where we can live, that we will have killed our mother. We're on the verge of doing so. We have very little time left to act like human beings, to act like relatives of our whales and our salmon and our eagles and understand. We act like relatives who are grateful to our Creator. We stop what we're doing where you started in your remarks about the continued raping of our resources, the exploitation, the destruction. And when I was on that stage with Andrew Scheer and he was saying, well, you can't have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People or you'll never build another project, it was very clear that he's unfit to ever be Prime Minister because he doesn't understand at all. This country will not have a future without fundamentally realigning our values. As Jody has said, we need to fundamentally realign our values so that the questions of who are we on this planet, to whom are we grateful? I am not grateful to the multilateral corporations. I am grateful to the Creator. And every single day I need to re-examine in my heart that we're doing those things that perpetuate life for ourselves, for our children, for our grandchildren, and into the 7th generations. We have to get the exploitative industrial lobby to align with respect for creation, or we don't have a future. And they can make a lot of money. I'm not against making money, but I don't want to make it by killing our mother. I also want to acknowledge some relations. I know that Joan's wonderful husband, Stuart, is over there. And I have been jealous of you two for so long you don't know, because no event starts without you talking about how much you love each other and how many years you've been together. So it happens that the Green Party candidate for Mission Matsqui Fraser Canyon is over there. Now he's 71 and I'm 65. So unless there's a really huge miracle of biblical proportions, the two of us are not going to be together as long as you guys have been together. I just want to say, love my husband. He's running in Mission Matsqui Fraser Canyon. Give him a chance, John Kidder.
Microphone 6 to Jane Philpott, then to Bob Chamberlain. And then I'm afraid we'll be closed out of time.
Thanks, Chief Willie. I just wanted to acknowledge your comments and to thank you for your kind words of support toward me for some of the things that took place over the last 8 months. And I just wanted to say that what I did in stepping down from cabinet in recognizing that I could not maintain solidarity with what was taking place is only what I would expect every member of Parliament to do. And I think that this room, what I want to say is that you should be, as you are, I know, extremely proud of Jody Wilson-Raybould. She, along with a few really extraordinary staff, upheld the independence of our justice system in a brave, proud way that no Attorney General of this country has ever done before. And I just want to thank all of you around the table. I want to particularly acknowledge the regional chief who spoke out immediately when this took place on behalf of Jody, and for all of you who have continued to stand up for her. Don't ever lose courage in standing up for what Jody did, because she called out a very serious attempt to interfere with the biggest corporate criminal trial in Canadian history, and our country owes her a debt of gratitude. Thank you for standing by her. I know you all would.
Microphone 6, Bob Chamberlain.
I want to build on your statements, Jane. Jody, I know when the story broke on the SNC Lavalin, I felt bad for Prime Minister Trudeau because I knew what he was saying was wrong, because I knew that you speak only the truth. And I've had the great pleasure of working with you for 6 years on the Leadership Council and to witness firsthand over and over and over again the integrity that you carry, and the truthfulness in all that you do, and the thoroughness of all that you do. And I was always very grateful when the media was asking me to speak about the situation, because I never wavered. I continuously spoke about your integrity, and your honesty, and the hard work. And I also recall when the rough road happened at the AFN, and I remember I couldn't be there for the rebuttal time because I was in the hospital. But I do remember your response and the dignity that you showed all Canadians then. And I know those teachings and the way that you are emanate from our people's culture of truthfulness. And so I just want to thank you for Douglas, for who you are. And very proud to come from the same village. It means a lot to me. Willie, thank you for your support. I've had the great pleasure of working with you over the years. And the comment that you mentioned about recognizing the people that have seriously moved the yardsticks for First Nations people. I'm a bit surprised that we don't find a way to honor all the people that have taken it upon themselves in the face of the colonial government to stand up and fight for what's right. I remember when I first started getting inspired about First Nation politics, it was dancing around the tables, to see Bill Wilson so eloquently just stick it to the Crown. And with very direct honesty, calling it for what it is. And the sad part is what it is still continues today. And I'm thinking about all the Supreme Court rulings, Calder, Guerin, Sparrow, Bob and White, all of them. And I think that all of our people, we owe a collective debt to these leaders, because they stood up at a time when it was the most difficult thing to do, and they drew from the strength of their teachings and their people to do that for our people. And I think that that is something that really needs to be celebrated. Our children need to learn about the people that made the path for what it is today. And I think that that's really important, because this is part of Canada's history. This is part of Canada being told about the colonial wrongs that they continue to do and continue to do. And the one thing that I've often spoke about, especially after implementing the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People on fish farms, consent will never be realized in consultation. Consultation, as we all know, is Crown designed, Crown implemented, Crown prioritized, and Crown decisions, where they embrace the justification argument to override our human rights. And to me, that's utterly unacceptable, and that we need to find a way to keep pushing shared decision-making. It's possible. We did it with fish farms. 30-year fight, incredibly contentious, very complicated, but we accomplished it. And I want to continually put that in front of both federal and provincial governments that it can be done. The process was supported by both industry partners that were affected because it was inclusive, it was transparent, and it was respectful. And both fish farm companies wrote letters of support for it. This is what I think we need to be putting in front of the government to push our authority, our inherent jurisdiction to make decisions in our territories, period. And to ensure that it is a shared decision-making model where what we know, what we live, what we experience is respected in the greatest way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I do want to note we've arrived at the time where we are needed to conclude this session. I do want to apologize to those at microphone 16, 11, 23, 19, and any other member or any other candidates that I may have missed in the back and forth there. In response to that last question, Jody had asked for the microphone at microphone 5, and then we'll turn to the regional chief for the thank yous.
Thank you, Harold. And I just wanted to say, Gala Kasla, to Chief Blackwater, thank you for your kind remarks, and thank you to my extraordinary friend Jane Philpott for your comments, and Owadi and everyone for your ongoing support. And I'll say a couple of things. Again, this election is incredibly important. The voices of Indigenous peoples in this election are incredibly important. When I look around the room and I see people from right across the country that come from nations that have been here since time lost in memory, I see the resilience of our people. And I see how important it is that the teachings of our people and the solutions that we know we have to advance Aboriginal title and rights and create space for Indigenous people in this country are here. Your support of me personally has enabled me to move on along with the teachings of my ancestors. And one thing that I've learned, and I said this at a ceremony that we held in our big house in Campbell River, one of the reasons why I went to Ottawa in the first place was to do my part to try and create the space for Indigenous peoples to be self-determining, including self-governing, and rebuild our nations within a stronger Canada. What I learned is that Canada and the government has an extraordinary amount to learn from Indigenous peoples, our worldview, how we conduct ourselves, and that is reflective of each and every one of you around this table. So Gala Kasla and I am more empowered than ever, and I suspect we all are, to continue to advocate for the recognition of Indigenous rights and title within the country of Canada. Thank you so much.
Masai, thank you. So this morning, I was supposed to speak to the CBC in regards to what we were discussing here, the many topics at this assembly over the last 3 days, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But the question that came up was what had occurred over the last 18 hours of this brown face, black face picture, 2 pictures and a video. And that was the question, what do I think about it? It is racist. It's reprehensible. And as I sat here and as our candidates talked about that issue, I continued to think about it. We're all here as leaders, politicians, we got thick skin. And I think about, this racist perpetuation of this dark skin that the Prime Minister was really putting out there. And I thought about it because, quite frankly, I could take a hit, but I think about our children. I think about my son and my daughter who are dark-skinned. and to all the youth that you represent who are in public school. Because quite frankly, this has come up in my home, and my kids bring it up about the issue of racism. And I certainly hope, Michelle, like you said, that this is a moment in time that it exposes the issue, as Bob said, that racism exists in Canada. It's alive and well. And I think there's a real moment here to learn, and for his sake, Trudeau, that he learns, and also that this country learns that it's not okay to make fun of or mock dark-skinned minorities and not acknowledge our lived-in realities. Whether you're an Indigenous person that lives here or somebody that came over from a different country. So I'll leave that there, and I'm really glad that you accepted this invitation to come to this AGM and provided your perspective. With all due respect, I think this was better than the leadership debate we saw witnessed the other day. Sorry, Elizabeth. Most of you are Indigenous here, Elizabeth and Jane, being non-Indigenous. We certainly know that there are candidates out there that can be allies to First Nations people, so never forget that. In the end, for you, the chiefs, the leaders, and for our people out there, get informed, know who your candidate is, and know that who you represent, who you want to represent in Ottawa, might be sitting up here or might be out there to represent our lived-in journey as Indigenous peoples. So, as a token of our appreciation, I do have gifts for you. So thank you for coming here today, and thank you for really bringing forward your party's perspective and your independent perspective. Masai Cho. Thank you.
Thank you, Artsy.
I don't have money bags. No, don't.
Love is all I need. Oh, look at
Generous again.
That's good. Thank you.
Might have to start believing in politics again. Ladies and gentlemen, just as we are doing the gifting and completing, I do want to note we are going to continue with the agenda that you have put before us, and shortly we will turn to the UVic Reconciliation Art Project. I do note that Kerry Newman has indicated this morning that he's unable to attend, and so I have to give grudging admiration to candidate Bob Chamberlain for managing to get himself on the agenda twice. Yeah.
I didn't expect to get a gift. All right.
Bob. Oh, you want to join? Pictures. Yeah. All right, we'll just take a moment. The candidates are gathering here for a photo. If anybody wants to join in and take a photo, please make your way there quickly. If we could get the candidates in front of the screen for a photo, please.
I know. Totally. I know. Hey, how are you? Good.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. There's always a moment during an assembly when the chair has to recognize the reality that they've lost all control of the process. So I do want to call the assembly back to order as quickly as we can. And I will note to candidate Bob Chamberlain that you are on deck to speak to the next agenda item. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let us retake our chairs, please, and resume our seats, and let us pick up with the business that we have before us. I will let the candidates know that they're, of course, welcome to stay with us to the degree that their schedule allows. I do note that Jody had noted that she was doing her book launch today at noon.
Yes, I gotta go.
Chapters on Granville.
Chapter Broadway and Granville.
The Broadway in Granville.
Thank you.
Yes, not here. That was awesome.
Thanks for including me. Really
You guys are going to make me believe in politics again. All right, ladies and gentlemen, final notice that we're about to reconvene the assembly. I'll ask you to begin making your ways back to your chairs. I'll ask the candidates to please move to the sides of the room. And then I'll ask you to begin wrapping up your side conversations or media interviews as the case may be. As you will note on your agenda, 13 minutes ago we were to come to the discussion on the University of Victoria's Reconciliation Art Project. As noted, Carrie Newman, the artist, was unable to be available, but Bob Chamberlain is a part of that project, and we'll ask him to speak to it as briefly if we could.
Yeah, I'll be quick.
Okay, so for the last time, I'll ask you to wrap up your conversations, and please return your attention to the podium where we have a presentation on our next item, the UVic Reconciliation Art Project. Bob.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Again, I want to acknowledge that we're on the territory of the Musqueam Nation. As Harold has asked for me to be brief, I know that's going to be a bit of a surprise for all of you, but I will be. I'm here to talk on behalf and with Carrie Newman. He's an amazing artist. He's also part of the Kwagilth, the Kwakwaka'wakw people. You may remember that he did the witness blanket from the residential school to be able to spread the word and begin to breach or build a bridge to the communities in Canada to reach an understanding of what's occurred at the residential school. And so he has another vision to advance this, and he wants to be able to see the Witness Legacy Center be established at the University of Victoria. And this is going to be housed at the Fine Arts Department, and it's going to be a place where First Nation artists from across BC, but specifically 3, will come forward and be able to assist and create a place for First Nations people to be able to pursue future works, to use art as a means to express what has happened with the residential school, to be able to use the medium of art to ensure Canadians have another understanding of the need for reconciliation, and to understand that we want to be able to see our beautiful artwork that we all have be able to be used in a means at a point of evolution to be able to reach over to the broader context of Canada to understand what's happened, to understand the legacy of residential school. And so he's asked, I started to email back and forth with Kerry over the past number of months, and I fully support this. And you've heard me say time and again that definitely the political, legal reconciliation needs to occur in Canada, but we also need to pursue societal reconciliation so the broader society of Canada can understand First Nations people, and we must develop and design new ways to accomplish that bridge building. And so this effort is one of those pieces that could reach out to Canadians. And with the fact that it's going to be housed at the University of Victoria, we can then reach and bring that information to a younger generation that have grown up without knowing none of what has happened. And so I've asked the BCAFN staff to distribute to you the proposal and the briefing notes, so you'll get it in due course. And I'm hoping that in some manner that the BCAFN Chiefs in Assembly here can pass a resolution to be able to support this effort. And the last I want to state is that this project is already broadly supported by the province of British Columbia. But it was put to Kerry that it would be good if he could demonstrate that there's First Nation support. And so I'll leave that there, Harold. I think that was brief. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rob. That was 4 minutes. That was awesome. Thank you very much. That was 4 minutes. That was awesome. All right, just a reminder, the deadline for late resolutions occurs in just over an hour or so at noon, so just a note on that, and a reminder again about the survey on climate change and the $5,000 grant and iPad attached to that at the front door there. Noting on your agenda, we turn to the 1040 item, the cannabis legalization and regulation. We are joined by members of the Joint Working Group on the legalization regulation of non-medical cannabis in British Columbia. Chief Harvey McLeod is the BCAFN representative on that group, and Wes Sam is the co-chair of the Joint Working Group himself. So I'll turn it to the gentleman here at microphone 5 and 6, and take that in the order that you need.
What a way to begin our session following just what we just experienced. It was so wonderful to hear and see our First Nations people standing up and leading a charge to bring change in Ottawa. I want to thank Morgan for the warm welcome this morning. I want to say welcome and thank you for being here, chiefs and delegates. My name is Harvey McLeod, and I'm the Chief Almihom for Upper Nicola Band, Okanagan Nation. We would like to begin by acknowledging that we are so fortunate to be gathering on unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I want to thank their leadership, their elders, and their community for always giving us a warm welcome into their homeland to do our work. Thank you. We'll be giving a really quick update on the work that we've been doing here in British Columbia regarding the cannabis file issues, work that is happening in so many communities across the territory. As you know, there are many First Nations, and a lot of our people, a lot of our entrepreneurs are engaged in the cannabis economy, as well as having a lot of dialogue surrounding the health and social impacts of cannabis. As we know, the federal and provincial governments have passed laws and implemented regulations in relation to the production, distribution, sale, and consumption of cannabis. Some First Nations and business people, our entrepreneurs, have navigated the processes as a means to enter the economy, attract capital, and create jobs. First Nations have also been occupying this space by exercising their inherent right and jurisdiction and implementing their own laws in relation to cannabis. In BC, the Cannabis Distribution Act set up the BC Liquor and Cannabis Regulation Branch as a monopoly to run a provincially owned online store and to distribute cannabis to provincially licensed retail stores. However, there is currently a backlog in the provincial licensing process. And a lot of our communities, a lot of our entrepreneurs have run into this roadblock. And there's a lot of frustration in navigating the path of getting a license. The Cannabis Control and Licensing Act addresses issues such as the minimum age for purchasing, selling, and consumption, possession restrictions, restrictions on public use, and requirements on personal cultivation. Right. In BC, First Nations have also benefited from the work done on our behalf by the First Nations Health Authority, which have been active in promoting awareness surrounding cannabis use. We have a lot of questions from our citizens, our people, especially our moms and grandmothers, about why are we allowing this. But since the discussions began, we're having some really good dialogue and sharing of understanding, benefit, and concern. And First Nations Health Authority have been influential in bringing that education and awareness to our communities. The First Nations Leadership Council was invited by the province of British Columbia to establish a joint working group on the legalization and regulation of non-medical cannabis in BC. This was established last year in 2018. First Nations Leadership Council representatives include the BCAFN, the First Nations Summit, and the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, and 7 Indigenous Nation community representatives who bring the technical and political influence to the table. The First Nations Health Council and the First Nations Health Authority have also participated. The province of BC is represented by the BC Cannabis Legalization and Regulation Secretariat, as well as provincial representatives from across the government and a representative from Health Canada. The joint working group began meeting in July 2018. Some of the individuals that were in our original committee were just speaking to us, and I thank Cheryl Casimir for setting us up and participating in the early days of getting this going. But as in most cases, when we set up a new group, we kind of went silent for the majority of 2019. While the Secretariat sought a mandate to work on issues raised by the representatives of the working group, there were a lot of concerns and issues that we're bringing up that the Secretariat couldn't answer. And if they couldn't answer, they went to their ministers and the government to get the mandate to have them discussions with us. We recently reconvened on August 30th to begin our first phase of concrete action. Today we will share the goals of the First Nations Leadership Council in relation to the joint working group, some of the challenges we have encountered, outcomes from our first BC Cannabis Forum held in March of this year, and progress we have made and hope to make going forward. First Nations, the FLNC working group representatives are guided by a principled framework, namely the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, commitment document principles, and action and constitutional rights. We aim to center and uphold our inherent Indigenous right. In March of this year, the First Nations Leadership Council hosted the first BC First Nations Cannabis Forum to discuss and hear from leaders, business people, entrepreneurs, and community members on issues and questions relating to the impact, challenges, and opportunities that come with the legalization and regulation of non-medical cannabis in Canada and in BC in particular. We heard from a number of speakers about the current law and jurisdiction, the health and social impacts, along with economic development opportunities and the challenges. Wes and I, or Cheryl and I, provided an update on the Cannabis Working Group at the March Forum. There was also discussion about some fundamental questions aimed at creating space for sharing and visioning for the future. We wanted space, including what is your community doing with cannabis in relation to law, health, and safety, and/or economic development? 2, what are the challenges you have experienced and solutions and priorities you would like to see advanced? 3, and what do you envision for the future? The key themes coming out of the March event were related to 1, health, a huge concern, a lot of issues. Jurisdiction, who has the authorities when it comes to regulating cannabis? Dialogue and information, we needed to have more talk amongst ourselves and with government. Licensing, economic development opportunity, and retail. This graph shows how many different issues, often overlapping, that came up in people's comments and responses. Not surprisingly, health was the biggest area of discussion, and the specific topics were wide-ranging. Quality, safety of products, safe usage, harm reduction, and the use of cannabis as a method of addressing opioid addiction, mental wellness, and cannabis as a form of traditional medicine were highlighted. Also expressed was a desire for continued and strengthened involvement by our First Nations Health Authority. On the area of jurisdiction, we heard a desire for nation-to-nation relationships between First Nations and between First Nations and the Crown, and that licensing processes and revenue distribution reflect this relationship. We heard very clearly that First Nations expect to be fully engaged on the development of legislation and policy. The length of the licensing process was highlighted as a concern, and an expedited process was advocated. For those of you who are involved in pursuing a license, you know what I'm talking about. It takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of resources to get to the stage where you can be considered to be given a license or awarded a license. Concern was also expressed about the number of licenses, the suggestion being there is a shortage. We heard concerns about the prospects of a provincial monopoly, and some participants shared that their nations are creating their own laws in relation to cannabis. There is a desire for more information and dialogue. And by this I mean an emphasis on reducing stigma and increasing awareness about the benefits and risk of cannabis use. Accessing and utilizing information regarding licensing and business development, and the need for constructive dialogue at the community level in the community. Many participants mentioned a gap between elders and youth, whereby youth generally appear to have a more favorable opinion of cannabis, its use, and economic development associated with the cannabis industry. Participants expressed interest in economic development. Our communities are interested in the positive benefits this industry could bring in the areas of jobs, diversification, eliminating poverty, nation-to-nation trading, participating in an auxiliary services market, and becoming self-sustaining. Participants also cited capacity and capital challenges and questioned how these opportunities might be available for remote communities. Developing good partnerships and the relationships between bands, chief and council, and individual entrepreneurs were also noted as an area that require more attention. In the areas of retail, participants noted that dispensaries are opening in First Nations communities. They have a desire to ensure so-called gray market dealers are selling safe products. Some of the challenges referenced related to accessible prices and oversized strict packaging regulations. In addition to typical retail stores, participants also envision participating in a variety of services that accompany this market and developing a First Nations or red brand. There are also comments that revolved around approaching cannabis from a more traditional perspective and approach as a traditional medicine with more ceremony and ritual with respect to cultural values, to integrate traditional learning and to have counselors and retail stores serve as a cultural function. There was a lot of information shared, a lot of good ideas, and all of the concerns and ideas that were raised have impacts in each and every one of our communities. Besides the introduction of cannabis, we also have some discussion in our communities about hemp. And there will be more discussion around that as we progress in our discussions and talks with ourselves and with the Crowns. With that, I'll pass it over to Wes to speak on the Leadership Council's mandates. White, thank you.
Thank you, Chief McLeod. Based on what we heard at this forum and the political and technical expertise of those on the working group, the FNLC developed the BC First Nations Framework and Action Plan that outlines the context, principles, what we heard from the forum, the progress made so far, and proposed action plan. Today's resolution seeks a mandate to pursue the approach outlined in this plan, which has been endorsed by the chiefs and councils at UBC-IC meeting this past June. The FNLC and Secretariat both come to the working group table with different mandates, but are working to address and create a mutual plan. The FNLC is pursuing specific actions under each of the priority areas that have been identified by First Nations Working Group representatives and are expressed in resolutions of the AFN, including economic development capacity, separate and supported licensing processes, data monitoring, public education and awareness, jurisdiction, revenue sharing, health considerations, and impacts. The plan outlines actions under each of the proposed A priorities, as well as rationale, responsibilities, and approximate timeframes. I'll take some time to walk us through it. In the area of economic development, the plan calls on the FNLC to 1, jointly identify the most feasible and effective economic development initiatives, including partners and necessary resources, and including the potential for exploring options for First Nations expedited license process at the federal level, and First Nations specific expectations and regulations at the provincial level, such as an Indigenous sourced product strategy for the LCBD. 2, call on the federal and provincial governments to ensure that a quota of licenses are dedicated to First Nations. To support separate and supported licensing process for First Nations, actions include inviting the Navigator Service to attend the Joint Working Group meeting with the goal of supporting increased effectiveness of this service, as we know there are mixed reviews, in addition to the actions under economic development. Data and monitoring commits to the FNLC to share information and build awareness of the evolving context. Public education and awareness calls on the FNLC to identify and support access to information regarding all aspects of cannabis, health, markets, legal and policy processes, and make resources available to constructive community dialogue. Under jurisdiction of the FNLC is seeking the mandate for the following items which are in alignment with the resolutions passed by the AFN. 1, call upon Canada to amend Bill C-45 to recognize that First Nations jurisdiction supersedes provincial legislation and regulation as it pertains to cannabis licensing, production, distribution, and sale of legalized cannabis. 2, advocate for the province to enter into Section 119 agreements for First Nations if they so desire. 3, support the development of First Nations cannabis jurisdiction option that includes First Nations distribution centers and retail, a First Nations stamp, and a cannabis excise tax sharing. 4, support the development of necessary amendments and recommendations to any regulations related to the Cannabis Act. 5, call on the federal and provincial governments to ensure that laws of general application do not apply on reserve where First Nations have jurisdiction. 6, support the development of the necessary First Nations institutional framework to implement a comprehensive First Nations cannabis jurisdiction option for interested First Nations. Under revenue sharing, continue to monitor the feasibility and communicate the priority of revenue sharing. Under Health considerations and impacts, allocate JWG meeting time for the Secretariat and FNHA to provide updates on their education and awareness initiatives and determine potential areas of collaboration, gaps, and how this work may be strengthened. And finally, to ensure that FNLC priorities are reflected in the working group's terms of reference and are supported by membership and engage in upcoming legalization of edibles, concentrates, and topicals that are set for this October. While the working group has provided a good opportunity to share information, we have not yet been able to make progress on matters like revenue sharing, jurisdiction, or specific licensing provisions for Indigenous nations. However, we continue to seek ways to integrate this work at the working group and by elevating issues raised at the working group to the political level. We expect to have a meeting with Minister Farnworth on these issues shortly. We'd asked that a number of weeks ago, and he's willing to meet, but we don't have a date as of yet to meet with Minister. In the next quarter, we expect our mutual agenda to include developing a framework to provide featured shelf space for Indigenous produced cannabis products in public stores, a virtual space on the liquor distribution branch website, farm to gate or seed to sale, communication regarding the implementation of Section 119 of the Cannabis Control and Licensing Act, which provides for the government of BC to enter into agreements with an Indigenous nation with respect to cannabis, including the sale of cannabis. Developing avenues to enhance access to capital and training for First Nations and Indigenous entrepreneurs who want to participate in the economic opportunities offered in the sector. One of the greatest barriers we've been finding throughout BC and the rest of the country for First Nations is raising capital for the cannabis industry, whether it be for LP, micro licensing, or storefronts, or production, or what have you. Not even the banks are opening bank accounts for this industry. It's very difficult to get into. So definitely capital. We hope the province of BC will assist to alleviate that. The FNLC will also be working on identifying and supporting access to information regarding all aspects of cannabis, health, markets, legal and policy processes, and making resources available for constructive community dialogue. Supporting the development of a First Nations cannabis jurisdiction option that includes First Nations distribution centers and retail, a First Nations stamp or red market, a cannabis excise tax sharing, and associated legislative and institutional frameworks at this federal level. BCAFN will be developing a variety of policy discussion papers as a part of its economic development strategy, which will help provide data and insight to support policy discussions at the working group level. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to your comments or questions. I will, and we will be here the rest of the day, so during lunch or after or now.
Just a quick update. The work that we're doing was supported by resolutions that were passed for the BCAFN last year, March, in Prince George, and more recently, 2 resolutions passed at the AFN Assembly in Fredericton. And as a result of the resolutions passed in Fredericton, we now have AFN Chiefs Committee on Cannabis. That committee is chaired by Regional Chief Terry Teegee, and I've recently been asked to sit on that Chiefs Committee. So we have a lot of work, really a lot of items on the agenda, and it's going to be challenging for us to come together across the country on how we're going to move forward on this. But I know that we have no option but to find a way on how we can work together. So with that, White Limland.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Appreciate that. I just wanted to note there is the resolution. We will need to come to it this afternoon when we get to the resolutions pieces. In terms of our agenda, we do have a presentation on Child and Family Services, and then Minister Eby, the Attorney General, is en route to speak to the legislative issues. So there are also some Child and Family Services resolutions, which we will then need to come to at the end of the day. What I'd like to do is let's thank our, yeah. All right, and so I just want to thank the gentleman and note that in the resolutions package, the draft Cannabis Framework and Action Plan is included, which they've walked through. So let us thank them for the presentation, and we'll come to that decision matter later. Yes. Is that yours? Thanks again. All right, thank you. Let's do the child. Okay. All right, then we're going to move quickly to the brief update on the child welfare. We may need to abbreviate that both before and after lunch, and so we'll just leave EB 15 minutes. Yeah. Okay. So we are joined by the Regional Chief, by Cheryl Casimir, and by Cookbee Judy Wilson, who are on the tripartite working group on the Child and Family Services. So I'll look to the three of them to organize the Regional Chief. Are we turning to you first? Cook. So which, microphone 5?
Thank you. Deneza, Tsekuza, Skyza, Chiefs, Hereditary Chiefs, delegates. Just first of all, I want to thank Mr. Guerin for welcoming this morning, and also thank the Musqueam people for allowing us in the territory. First of all, I just want to thank my 2 colleagues here on this file. They've been really a big part of this file and making sure that we move ahead with it and are responsible and accountable for it. And I think we're really in a time where we're seeing change. We're seeing change in terms of legislation, the commitment towards the legislation, the federal legislation, and now moving on as a part of the tripartite working group with the provincial and federal government to see changes in the province so we can take over jurisdiction of our children. And for decades we've seen that. for far too long that our children have been taken away, and we need to put a stop to that. And we've seen some commitments over the last week here with the end to birth alerts. And as First Nations, we all have our own laws and our ways and means to take care of our children, regardless if they're in our communities or outside of our communities, and that really has to be recognized. And finally, the time of seeing those efforts become into reality, Canada and BC have begun to take the steps necessary to transfer the jurisdiction of children and family services back to our people. And I think it's really also neat to note that as your regional chief and as this region, we're in a really unique position because, quite frankly, no other area in this country do we have the provincial and federal government at the table. We're the only jurisdiction, we're the only area and region where we're creating change, and many of the other regions are watching, including Saskatchewan and other areas. So moving forward, I really want to thank you for attending today and over the last 2-3 days at this assembly on this important matter, and I pass it on to my colleagues for the update. Cookby? Oh, Cheryl.
Thank you, Regional Chief. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to start off by acknowledging the territory of the Musqueam, as well as acknowledge them for being gracious hosts and opening up their doors for us to do this important work. I'd also like to acknowledge Morgan for opening up our forum for the last couple of days. And lastly, acknowledge each and every one of you for being here over these 3 days to discuss these important issues. What I'm going to present to you is an update on what's happening federally, and my colleague Cookby Wilson will talk about what we're doing provincially. And then we'll probably wrap it up with giving you an update on what's happening at the tripartite working table between the Leadership Council, British Columbia, and Canada. I was really happy to see comments coming from the candidates this morning. We definitely have a strong contingent of Indigenous leaders that have put their name into the hat and lobbying to make some significant change so that our issues as Aboriginal people in this country can be heard, and that we have a voice at the federal level. I was glad to hear that the child and family is a priority with some of the candidates that made comments in their opening. And most particularly, I wanted to acknowledge Jane Philpott for the work that she did when she was the minister. It was through Jane that she called that emergency meeting that took place a couple of years ago now, and she deemed it a humanitarian crisis, the situation of child welfare in this country. And a lot of us went to Ottawa, I believe it was in Ottawa, and we spent a couple of days there addressing the issue of the dire state of child welfare in the country, and developed a plan. And we took that work and we came back to British Columbia, and we had numerous engagement sessions to talk about how we move forward here in BC. Now, it's not anything new to us. We knew that it was an issue. We see it and we live it every day in our communities. And for some of us, it's quite personal for having, our own family in care. A lot of us have also been impacted by residential schools and the 60 scoop. So what Jane Philpott had said was not new to us, but what was new was the profile that she was able to shine on this situation that we'd never really had before by anybody in the federal government. So as a result of that, I think everybody's aware that Bill C-92 received royal assent on June 21st of this year. And so this groundbreaking piece of legislation was a direct result of years of advocacy efforts by First Nations, much of which started and was carried out here in British Columbia. Earlier this month, Canada announced that the bill will be fully brought into force on January 1st, 2020. Since the bill received royal assent on June 21st, we've been pushing Canada to bring it into force immediately as a Leadership Council. We raised this with Minister O'Regan during our caucus session at the AFN meeting in New Brunswick this past summer, and raised its importance at every opportunity that we get. And so we were pleased when the announcement finally came that January 1st it'll receive royal assent. So we're continuing our advocacy work at this time, working with Canada and British Columbia to ensure that we have a BC-specific process for transition to jurisdiction to make sure that it's developed and implemented and adequately funded here in British Columbia. At the national level, Canada indicated that they were going to be creating distinctions-based governance tables to do this work. We support the need to ensure that First Nations are involved in the process at all levels, but we don't want to see British Columbia held back or negatively impacted by this type of approach. For far too often, and I think we're all too familiar with what happens when things get dealt with at a national level, it's really hard to make sure that your distinct interests and needs are reflected in that work. And so that's why we've been pushing for a BC-specific process. We already have structures and relationships here in British Columbia, as Regional Chief indicated in his opening comments, that we are the only region in the country that has a relationship with British Columbia. And British Columbia is fully on board in supporting us in doing this work and have been by our side lobbying and advocating when necessary with Canada, particularly for supporting our BC-specific process, as well as identifying the funding that needs to come with that for us to do that work. Many of us have been doing this work for a long time, and I know that we are ready to move forward. There are a number of tables already that are established and doing that work at community nation level in terms of addressing the issue of jurisdiction. And we want to be able to continue to support the work at those tables. What we do at the Leadership Council meeting is no way intended to complicate or halt or do anything to stop that work that's already happening. If anything, we're just wanting to make sure that we create the space available for those discussions to take place. And we know that resourcing is a huge issue, so we continue to lobby and advocate for that. Jane, in her comments, asked us again today to make sure that we continue to put the call out for the proper resourcing necessary to work towards implementing the bill, to work towards supporting us to develop our own laws on child and family. And we know that the bill is not perfect. There are some shortcomings with that, and we've heard it from you here around these tables as well as across the country, most particularly the issue around no statutory funding attached to the bill. But I think because of the relationship that we have here with British Columbia at our tripartite table, that we are hammering away on that issue and that we are working to continue to obtain commitment from Canada and British Columbia to find the resourcing necessary for us to do that work. We are miles ahead from a lot of regions across this country. They know that. Minister O'Regan even indicated himself that he knows that we're ready to go. He doesn't want to stand in our way, and he made the commitment that he would look to see in how we can find resourcing to support the work here. You're also probably aware of the recent victory for our children and our families with the recent CHRT decision that came down on September 6th. The ruling found that Canada willfully and recklessly discriminated against First Nations children and families, and that those who had been discriminated against are entitled to compensation of up to $40,000 for the discrimination and subsequent harm caused. Those who will be eligible for compensation under the decision include First Nation children who were unnecessarily apprehended on or after January 1st, 2006, parents or grandparents of children unnecessarily apprehended on or after January 1st, 2006, all children denied an essential service related to Jordan's Principle between December 12, 2007 and November 2nd, 2017. And I think it's really important to acknowledge Dr. Cindy Blackstock in all of the work and her tireless effort and commitment and dedication to holding Canada accountable for the way that they've treated our children and our families in the past. Unnecessarily apprehended. That means children who were apprehended for reasons such as poverty, inadequate housing, neglect, and substance misuse, and who were placed outside of their homes, families, and communities where prevention services would have allowed them to remain in their families and or communities. Canada has been ordered to enter into discussions with the National AFN and the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society as to a disbursement process and to return before the tribunal by December 10th. And we're hoping that that is what's going to happen because Canada still has an opportunity to appeal this decision to the federal court. The disbursement process will be confirmed at that time, and further information will be released to the public regarding how to apply for that compensation. And we will continue to monitor the progress on this decision and report out on any new information when it comes available. I think at this point in time in our history, it's critical that Canada does not appeal to the federal court on this decision. If they truly say that their relationship is important with Indigenous peoples in this country, and then they've claimed as well that it's a humanitarian crisis, that the way that child welfare is dealt with for Aboriginal Indigenous peoples in this country, then they need to stand by that decision, and they need to work with us in terms of fully implementing it so that there can be some justice for those children and those families that were treated so wrongly in the past. Thank you.
Kukshama, and thank you. I just wanted to acknowledge the ancestors here at Musqueam and the descendants today for doing the work. And also thank you to RC for the opening and Cheryl for the federal landscape. Hopefully Cheryl will do the TWG as well, update. For the provincial updates, I just wanted to ensure as Leadership Council that, you know, we are supporting and the nation-to-nation tables and that we're not seen as any interference to the table. The Leadership Council is just appointed from the respective organizations to be able to provide the information back to the chiefs and to be able to have that tripartite working table. And I constantly say that at all of the meetings. I'm recognizing, you know, that there are many those nation tables that are already doing a lot of the great work that Cheryl mentioned. To better ensure communications and transparency, there's been a protocol signed with Minister Conroy to discuss these issues with the province, and then also to be able to meet quarterly. So I just wanted to make sure the chiefs are aware of that. And one of the key concerns, as you heard both my colleagues talk about, was the practice of birth alerts. So that's being announced, that was announced Monday by Minister Conroy that the province would be immediately stopping that practice. And it's important to note that it's not enough yet by just announcing it. There's also a lot of the policy changes that have to happen, and the practices need to go beyond that so that we can stop the birth alerts totally. So there needed to be investment of resources into prenatal and prevention support services that can ensure Indigenous mothers are supported to remain with their children after birth, including extended stays in hospitals. Exhaustive efforts to be undertaken by the ministry in cooperation with the child's Indigenous community prior to discharge to place the child within their extended family or Indigenous community. Immediate action to be taken to address the cultural and systemic bias toward Indigenous mothers, including increased accountability measures for social workers. So those are the birth alerts, and I'm pretty positive every one of your community or your members that experience that. I know it happens in my community, and what a lot of the intervention measures are, some of our grandmothers actually had grandmother circles right around the baby and the mother so that the social workers couldn't apprehend the baby, and then work to put some sort of support measures around the mother and the child. I did an interview just the other day, I think it was with the Globe and Mail, in explaining what our community had to do, but with now the practice stopping and some of the policy changes, I'm hoping that improves, but there's still a lot of work in that area to do. So the ministry has committed to working on these issues, but they realize it's not only an issue that sits with the Ministry of Child and Family Development. The new policy does not address the discrimination that happens at the time of birth and the immediate postnatal. So there's, like I mentioned, there's a lot of work that needs to happen, especially the practice of flagging expectant mothers. That needs to stop. And there was a situation many of you are aware of with baby H. It was not until the baby was born the hospital staff made a complaint of neglect to the ministry, who then attended the hospital to remove the child. So those are the kind of things that we're saying has to stop. So the systemic discrimination in all these systems must be addressed. It must be a cross-ministry approach. Those messages are being conveyed, and many from the nations need to go directly to the ministry on how your community and your nation are dealing with that particular issue. It needs to be, the child needs to be protected at every stage of birthing, and at no time permitted for the child to be removed from the mother or at the hospital. One other important highlight is that there's a renewed relationship with the representative for children and family. Many years ago, you remember Mary Ellen was the representative, and we signed a communications protocol and cooperation protocol. She's left that position, so the protocol lapsed, so we're just renewing it. And then also that we focused on ensuring that the relationship and the communication is strengthened, and we have a new draft of the MOU. And it's in the resolution pack in your packages. One of the aspects is the data. As you know, over 50% of children are still in care that are Indigenous. So it's important to know the data. It's important for us to have certain data collected, and it's something that'll help you, your nations, or the proper title holders, as you're resuming jurisdiction over your children. So you need to have this important data to make your informed decisions, and also to know where the children are and what the needs and all of those things are. So I just wanted to highlight those MOUs and protocols, and especially the issue of birth alerts. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for listening. I just wanted to note that in Swatseen, Cookby Christians here, they're having a jurisdiction meeting with the nation tables. So there's a meeting at Swatseen coming up at the beginning of October 7th and 8th. And then on the 9th and 10th, we have a province-wide chiefs meeting with a full 2 days on children and family, Bill C-92, and the provincial level amendments and issues that we're dealing with. Thank you.
Thank you. Did I note that you had requested Cheryl to give an update on the TWG as well?
Thanks. I will try to be brief. A lot of it has already been covered. As mentioned earlier, the tripartite working group is comprised of the Leadership Council, Canada and British Columbia. We've been coming together for a while now, and as was mentioned, we're the only region that has such a table. And it's been an advantage for us to have that, particularly when we have willing partners who are sitting at the table with us. So to work strategically over the next fiscal year with our partners, the TWG developed a work plan and structure that will allow us to focus on key areas identified by First Nations in BC. These include fiscal relations and funding, resumption of jurisdiction, and practical implications for First Nations in British Columbia. This includes ensuring that there is alignment between federal and provincial legislation, that child and family services are adequately funded and resourced based on the principles of substantive equality, that there is the funding necessary for First Nations to come to the table and draw down on this legislation, and that jurisdiction discussions are First Nation directed and led. So to support this work, we've struck 3 technical working groups under the umbrella of the TWG. We recently put a call out to all First Nations in BC for regional representation and expertise to these working groups. I saw the notice come out, so just today I believe it was, so people should have that in their email. We recognize that much of the expertise in this work comes from the nation level and communities, and those who are doing this work on the ground. So we hope through the technical working groups that expertise can be best utilized. And I think it's also important to note that this is a recent change to the way that we were currently structured. We used to have an internal advisory group, and that was also made up of community representatives and experts. However, during a review of how we were operating and doing work, we recognized that we were not maximizing that expertise to its fullest. And so that's why we've changed now to establishing these working groups. And we're hoping that people that have that expertise will put their name forward and come and support the work of the Leadership Council and the action plan that was also developed through extensive engagement with First Nations across the province for the past couple of years. Gukbi Judy mentioned that on October 9th and 10th, we'll be hosting a 2-day All Chiefs Forum to discuss the jurisdiction and to talk about options and methods in which we will be able to move forward on the legislation and put into place strategic plans. At that time, we are also going to take some time to recognize the work and contributions and dedication of the members of the internal advisory and honor them and hold them up for all of the work that they've done for us. So I just wanted to let you be aware of that. One of the other things that we've highlighted as a TWG is the implementation of Jordan's Principle. That's going to be a key area of focus and work for us as well. BC has had some of the lowest numbers in Canada in accessing Jordan's Principle resourcing. And one of the reasons we believe for this is a lack of understanding about what Jordan's Principle is and what it can and cannot be used for. So by creating a strategic focus around Jordan's Principle under the TWG, we're hoping that we're going to be able to increase the awareness and access of those dollars. At the AFN in AGA, at the AFN AGA in Fredericton, I mentioned to you that Minister O'Regan came to our caucus. We tabled with him our work plan and structure with him. At the time, he gave strong support for the work happening in British Columbia and indicated a commitment to fund capacity building and jurisdiction tables here in BC at the nation level and to support a BC-specific process. Unfortunately, though, now that the writ's been dropped, we don't really see any substantive progress being made under that until after the October election. So we may not be able to access or get commitment to any new funding until a new government is confirmed. But despite that, we'll continue to push and advocate to make sure that we get the resources here that are required in British Columbia to support our nations and their work going forward. Again, just another plug-in for our Chiefs, all Chiefs meeting, October 9th and 10th. Hoping that I see the notice has also gone out for that, so you should have that in your emails, and hoping that you register and join us for those 2 days of discussions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Final remarks to Chief TG on microphone 5.
Thank you. Thank you to my 2 colleagues here. The other opportunity is at the upcoming Union of BC Indian Chiefs meeting and First Nations Summit meeting. I think the takeaways is for this initiative is it's a BC specific process. And I think it's really important that we have this opportunity and we take it upon ourselves to really assert our jurisdiction over child welfare. And the other, the resolution we do have today too is to renew our relationship with the the representative for children and youth. That resolution will be coming up today and I think there'll be mirrored resolutions with the other two organizations. So it was the organization that was used to be held by Mary Ellen Chappelle-Lafon, and I just want to acknowledge the work that she did on this file on our behalf as the First Nations Leadership Council. So, and there is a hiring of the RCY deputy. So if you know anybody, bring their names forward. So thank you for your attention. Basai.
All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I just wanted to note, just our time pressure, we are coming back to this discussion this afternoon on the three resolutions that have been mentioned. So at this point, we do have Minister Eby, who's present and does need to get downtown, as well as a number of our other participants for a 1 o'clock event. So let us thank our tripartite working group representatives for their presentation. And as they're doing that, I just want to then transition us, and we'll take this to maybe 12:10, and then we'll take our lunch break and adjust our time accordingly. And so please help me welcome the Honorable Minister David Eby, the BC Attorney General, also responsible for gambling policy, liquor policy, and the Insurance Corporation in BC, in case he's not busy enough as the Attorney General. Please help me welcome David.
Thank you very much, everybody, for the kind welcome, and thank you to the Musqueam people for hosting us here on their territory and in their beautiful community center this afternoon. It's an honor to be here with you again. We have a new member of our family at our house, 2 weeks old, so my goal today is to try to make sense. We're not getting a lot of sleep at our house right now. I'm sure a lot of you in the room can identify with that. I'll do my best. But I may take a little longer to make my long points than I usually do. My goal today is to give you a bit of an update. I understand that you've had updates from various folks in the tripartite working groups, the First Nations Justice Council, as well, about some of the work we've been doing together. You'll remember that in 2017 we set out a memorandum of understanding with the First Nations Justice Council, and it used to be the BC Aboriginal Justice Council, to work together and to have, for the first time, amazingly, in British Columbia, an Indigenous-led justice strategy for Indigenous people in our province, not just Indigenous-informed. So since signing that MOU, there has been a lot of work done on designing this collaborative justice strategy. It focuses on, obviously, reconciliation as a priority, decreasing overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system, improving the experience of Indigenous people in the justice system, addressing violence against Indigenous people, especially women and girls, and engagement with Indigenous communities and organizations in a respectful and culturally appropriate manner, as well as improving access to justice services for Indigenous people, and finally ensuring that services are available that provide Indigenous people with culturally relevant, flexible, and user-focused processes. It sounds a bit technical, but really this is a highly accessible document that has been the product of multiple meetings with communities. Some of you may have participated in the regional engagement sessions that were held throughout the summer with the First Nations Justice Council. Some of you may have been part of the big meeting we had with First Nations communities and service providers that work within First Nations communities on this justice strategy as well. And this work has really designed the strategy. It's determined what it looks like, what transformative change looks like for people, what they want to see, and what outcomes we should be trying to achieve. This is a document that's going to instruct government on how to work to improve the justice system for Indigenous people. And appropriately, it is coming from Indigenous people. Now, I understand that you got an update yesterday afternoon on the justice strategy, and that would be the best information on it, but I'll do my best to answer questions about where we are on that if you have any questions about that. Another major project that my ministry has underway is in relation to the UNDRIP legislation. You know that in July of 2017, all ministers were tasked with implementing UNDRIP within our various ministries. Within my ministry, that has meant working on legislation in relation to implementation of UNDRIP. What our goal is to work with First Nations across BC to create a predictable path forward for everyone, which means not just good jobs and opportunities, which is critically important, but also upholding Indigenous rights and protecting our environment. And there have been a number of folks that I understand gave you a technical update on that yesterday, the regional chief, as well as Minister Fraser and a technical team from the BC Assembly of First Nations. I'm sorry I missed that, but I hope it gave you a flavor of where we are going on this important legislation and a critical and historic step between First Nations and the provincial government in British Columbia. One of the additional pieces that I know is front of mind for many people is the overdose crisis that we face in the province. My colleague within the Ministry of Mental Health and Addiction, Judy Darcy, her ministry has been doing a lot of important work with Indigenous communities on this, and in particularly in supporting Indigenous communities and reclaiming your really rich history of wellness and health, and recognizing that we're not going to make progress on Indigenous wellness and health unless it's First Nations led, and that First Nations are in the best position to make decisions about how to move forward. And so that's why last year there was another historic tripartite agreement signed with First Nations and the federal government and our government around relationships related to justice, mental health, and wellness that puts First Nations communities in the driving seat on these important issues. The Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions also developed an important document called A Pathway to Hope, a roadmap for making mental health and addictions care better for people in BC. There's a strong focus in that document on self-determination for Indigenous people, as well as in relation to mental health and substance use care, and recognizing that cultural safety and humility across the system are critically important in order for Indigenous people to feel safe and comfortable within the services. Finally, there has been an important initiative put in place around addressing trauma, which is critically important, partnership with the First Nations Health Authority, a $20 million investment from the province to build, renovate, and expand First Nations run wellness and healing centers throughout BC, both on and off reserve. This will support land-based treatment that will improve access to healing programs grounded in First Nations culture, and we know how important access to land is for these types of programs. In summary, I'd like to say that certainly across government we know that action, not words, is the measure by which our reconciliation efforts will be judged, not just by the people in this room, but by people across the province and nationally and internationally. And so it's our goal certainly to continue the partnership that we've established and the strong relationship that we've established to transform our relationship going forward. And I'd love to hear any questions or comments or suggestions you have. Staff member from my office, Celia Panetta, is here as well to take notes and to keep track of any requests you may have so that we can follow up in a similar way that we did when I met with you, and I think we were in Merritt last time. So nice to see you again, and look forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Minister. Microphone 16.
Thank you for your presentation. Appreciate the work that you do. Judith Sayers, I am a proxy for Hadasat. Yesterday we did talk about the UNDRIP legislation, and I raised with Minister Fraser the fact that there's been very little or none consultation with respect to what should be in the UNDRIP legislation. And so we also have other issues with BC government, BC Hydro, consulting and working with us on things like the phase 2 of BC Hydro. And so I hear the commitment to work with First Nations and to talk to us, but we're being left out. And so I don't know with this UNDRIP legislation, with free, prior, and informed consent, what that's going to be. So my concern is that where is the voice of our people in that bill? But my question to you is this. So a lot of things I heard yesterday, I can't discuss this with you because I'm under an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. So how can we, or can you change that legislative process with respect to Indigenous people? Because we did the same things. We're drafting legislation together. We put our ideas together, put them forward, but they get out of our hands and they go into your legislative people, your lawyers, and it loses the heart and the feel of what we need and want in it. And so I would like to see our drafters part of that till the very end. And so I know your processes are different and say that can't happen. But if we truly want to develop or co-develop legislation, we need to be part of that process to the very end. If you want our free, prior, informed consent on legislation, we need to be there. So, we don't want to have to, when it comes out, we'll say, well, this, like we had to do with the federal government on languages, well, it didn't really fit the bill. It's nice, but it didn't do everything we wanted to do. We don't want to come out and condemn it. We'd like to say, wow, great victory. We did this together. That's what we're looking for. That's what we need from you. So I'm just wondering, are there ways that we can change that process so we can be a part of that? If we're truly building relationships, if we're truly looking at doing things together, it needs to be changed. And is that a possibility within your legislative realms? You're the government, you can do anything you want. Change whatever you want. No, so that's my question, is how can we do that? How can we be more fully involved to later stages in the drafting process?
Thanks very much for your thoughtful comments, Judith. We've been trying to reform our drafting processes to have increased engagement with First Nations people and co-drafting. The best example of that is the Environmental Assessment Act process to date, which had heavy involvement of folks from across the province in designing that legislation and coming to something that we could all see our goals reflected in. And it wasn't a perfect process. It was a very rocky road. It was the 1.0, right? It's like an app. It's the first version, 1.0. So 1.1 or 2.0 is this work that's happening around UNDRIP and the implementation legislation. I'm concerned to hear that you don't feel that we're hitting our goals yet around co-drafting and working together on that critically important bill that really needs to be created in partnership. That's the whole idea of it. If you raised it with Minister Fraser, that's the right place to raise it. But certainly I'll follow up with him about your concerns that we're still not there yet. It's new. It's very, sometimes the staff get very nervous because this hasn't happened before, but we've worked with them and they've come a long way. They've come a long way. And we've understood some of their concerns, and I think I can say that the First Nations folks that we've been working with, the leadership groups, have recognized that this is something that we're designing together, a process that's new. And what our hope is to, in partnership with the public servants, to bring them along too, because I know we'll be in government forever, but just in case something happened and we weren't in government, that there's a legacy behind of structures and ways that this can continue no matter who's in government, which is critically important to bring folks along on that. So I'll definitely bring your comments back that there's more work to do on that and try to get to the bottom of that. Thanks, Judith.
Thank you. Microphone 19. Chief Smahan.
Election 1 Hantla and Squash Lease Behind Cook Bevan Slutku in the Gatlam Nation. Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to ask you a few questions about commitment from the province, from the provincial government. The 5 Nicola bands want to do an MOU with the province in regards to for supported community reintegration. And would the province be committed to signing that MOU with us? And the reason I ask for a commitment from the province is because we've done a water pilot project in the Nicola Valley, and then we find out that we're getting funding cut by 25%. So those questions for you in regards to that, Gookstam. Thank you.
Sure, Chief. I have to confess I don't know anything about what you're talking about. And what would be best is if I could get some details from you about what the proposal is and where the funding was coming from and what it was funding in relation to your project. I'll be in a much better place to figure out which ministry we should be working with in terms of that MOU that you're talking about. It might be my colleague in Forest Lands and Natural Resources, it might be my colleague in MER, it might be my colleague in Energy and Mines. I'm not totally clear, and it might be other levels of government that we would have to work with as well. So I would need just a little bit more information from you about that project, but I'd be glad to hear about it. And I'll ask staff to follow up with you about that. And Chief, you said that there were a number of Nicola Valley bands that were involved in that project. Where would staff best follow up to get the details about what you're talking about?
Microphone 19, please.
We have two co-chairs for that, one with one of our chiefs and the other one is through FLNRO offices.
Through FLNRO? Okay. So if we talk to them about your water pilot project MOU, they'd know what we were talking about, hopefully. Okay.
Microphone 22.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Alrita Leask. I'm the proxy for Metlakatla First Nation. At the last BC cabinet meeting with First Nations, Metlakatla presented a proposal with regard to requesting a wellness center in Prince Rupert. All of the people on the North Coast who require the services of a wellness center currently have to go all the way to Prince George. So if individuals have to travel, for example, if you go by bus and you have to go all the way to Prince George, you know, you're on the bus for probably 12 hours. And we're aware that many of those clients, you know, jump off the bus and in reality don't even make it up to Prince George. So when we did go to the BC cabinet meeting that you held last time, we did take a proposal and gave it to many departments so that it would be on the radar. My understanding is that there are already wellness centers that have been designated in the province. So I'm just bringing it to the forefront again, so it'll be back on your radar again. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks very much for bringing that to my attention again. I'll follow up with Jen Rice, who's your local MLA there, and also follow up with MER. One of the interesting pieces in my ministry that may have some overlap is in the First Nations Justice Strategy that's coming together. Indigenous Justice Centers are front and center, these centers that would provide wraparound services for people who find themselves in contact with the justice system. Are going to be quite a cornerstone to the whole plan, and I'm really excited about them, and I'm hopeful that those will be able to provide some of the services to people who are facing mental health or addiction challenges, Indigenous-led centers. So that's an exciting opportunity as well that you should be sure to check in with the Justice Council about, and I'll make sure that we follow up on the Wellness Center proposal. Thank you.
All right, let's go to microphone 25, and then we'll make the transition to lunch.
Good morning. My name's Brian Lewis, Chief of the Okanagan Band. And I had one question I asked even of your counterparts in the federal government, and when we always hear the words reconciliation, but there's never been a definitive description of or a definition of what that actually is when we're talking this word reconciliation. When you look at a reconciliation from an international context, you could actually look at the reconciliation and in terms of resumption of good relationships after a long period of hostility. Well, that actually defines our relationship with Canada for the last 400 years. and well, 150 in our particular region. And if you actually look at that from that context of an international definition of reconciliation, it would be one that was made between the Axis powers and the Allied powers after the Second World War. And another example is the one after the First World War, where one party was actually able to not only rebuild socially, but also economically. Now, does reconciliation mean along those terms, or are we just talking about friendly relationships where we shake hands and pretend we actually have a good relationship again? And what I'm saying is there needs to be a defined definition of what reconciliation truly means in that context. Does it mean or give us the ability to rebuild socially and economically? Thank you.
Thanks very much for your comment. I think you're right. I mean, I think that the definition of reconciliation is an evolving thing. It's a journey that we're all on together, recognizing that the history of colonialism and trauma and war against Indigenous people needs to be made right. And I can just say that for myself, it feels like an incredible privilege that we actually get to work on reconciliation with so many communities that are willing to do that. You asked a very specific question about economic development, and that's critically important from my perspective, and certainly from the government's perspective. For example, the Gaming Grants Initiative, sending money directly, gaming money directly to nations that they can invest as they see fit to benefit their own people in any kind of economic development initiative that they want to is critically important. It isn't a grant that you have to have this certain fit within a certain parameter that's set out. This is for economic development, but not just that, opportunities in education and training across the province, as well as resource development opportunities with full participation and consent of First Nations communities, critically important. So absolutely, to my mind, and I know to the Premier's mind and to all of Cabinet, we recognize the importance of economic development and support for First Nations across the province as a key part of reconciliation. And that's not coming from us, that's coming from you and being reflected back, I hope.
All right. Quick follow-up. 25.
It's what you provided isn't really an answer or what actually I had said. What I said was a definition of that, and what you actually provided was little, basically snippets. Okay, one for economics, I think we're going to work there. One for social, and I think we're going to be evolving. But what I am saying is there needs to be some type of definition of what reconciliation really truly stands for. Because if I went around the table here and you ask each and every one of us individually, would probably have one answer, but you'd have another one. There needs to be a definition that actually is applicable. Now, if I'm talking about the reconciliation that happened under international standards, well, that's about allowing us the opportunity to rebuild socially. What that means is rebuilding our social fabric of our communities, and economics is basically, being able to be self-supporting, because those are two areas that we most desperately need. And people want to look around, and the only thing that we had previously was the Department of Indian Affairs, but theirs is basically a command and control structure that's been in existence since they were created, because that is not their duty and function to see us standing, but actually be dependent. Now, if you're talking about reconciliation, we need that definition. It's got to come from the province, and it's got to come from the federal government. That's something that we can point to and say, yes, that's definitive.
Just a quick response and maybe a small when you say at the end that the definition of reconciliation has to come from the province or from the federal government, I would say that actually the work on defining what reconciliation means is going to be led by Indigenous people, and necessarily so, it has to be. It's not up to me or to our government to say, okay, we'll be reconciled when this happens, and then it's done. It has to be something that together we agree these are the preconditions to getting to where we need to get to address this historic injustice that has been done to Indigenous people, and ongoing injustice that's being done to Indigenous people. So to my mind, it's a partnership. And if a fixed definition is really important in order for us to move forward, we should do that work. Certainly, I'm happy to bring back to the government that we should do that work on a fixed definition for reconciliation that we can all point at and say, yeah, this is what we're talking about.
All right, in the minute remaining, let's go to microphone 19. Chief Isfahan wanted a quick follow-up.
Yeah, thank you. I like that question that Byron answered, Chief Byron, and your answer about reconciliation. And you brought up gaming revenue, and I was just asking Chief Harvey how long it has taken the province to deal with gaming revenue sharing from the province and First Nations. Over 30 years.
Yeah, definitely.
And finally, First Nations get a piece of that pie, but the question I was asking Chief Mike Labordier this morning was about the cannabis and where are we at with dealing with the province and the feds on revenue sharing in regards to cannabis? Have you got an answer for that? And do we have to wait another 30 years for that?
So,
Cookstem.
Yeah, thanks very much. That work on gaming revenue sharing started under the NDP government in the 90s, and then when they lost election, then we went 16 years without any progress on it, and our government on coming back in, it took a year and a half before we were able to get there, and it's too long. On cannabis, we have a section of our provincial cannabis legislation that enables specific agreements with First Nations in the province around production and retail. We're working closely, and there have been challenges. I got your correspondence about Cowichan, and I thank you for the letter. There have been challenges, but we're working through them together. And our goal is to support cannabis as an economic development opportunity for nations that want that. Including various supports to get them there. That work on the Section 119 or 114 agreements under our Cannabis Act is happening right now with at least one nation and maybe two. So that is where we're going, and that work is underway.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. Do you have any final comments before we turn to the regional chief?
Wish you the best of luck with your meetings, and thank you very much for the privilege of being here today. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. So we are going to recess for lunch. It is available now. We'll reconvene on the schedule at 1 o'clock. I do want to remind you of the survey on the climate change, and Musqueam First Nation has asked us to note that there is a 50-50 outside. They are fundraising to restore one of their traditional ocean-going canoes, and so they wanted to encourage you to go out and contribute to that as well. All right, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Enjoy your lunch.